Well, that's a good one.
Something terribly controversial.
Oh, you're gonna set me up? Okay.
Set you up.
Thank you. Thank you.
You ever up that way? I just want to be able to see. Do that. Yeah.
Just sign them.
You know, put their kicker up.
That's how I started.
And he was really sick. But he went to show and he got a mole cut off the second cut off. That's kind of a competition. That's I slept in the recliner for 3 days. I feel like you
I don't know what the hell's gonna happen to that. I don't think anybody does. Are we broadcasting over the internet this time too? Okay. Oh, man.
Right now?
So we all better be good.
They've been listening to us for 30 minutes.
You should have told us a little while
All
ago.
2 people that are probably hate themselves enough to listen to this. Where's Harry? Oh, here's Harry.
No, listen.
Hear ye, hear ye. Yeah, they've been listening to us for 30 minutes. We've already spilled the beans.
Because of it's mostly Republican.
Right.
Okay, welcome to the joint meeting workshop meeting, between the Wyoming Water Development Commission and the Select Water Committee. First off, we will call roll. First for the commission, Mr. Secretary.
Nick Bettis, Karen Bud Fallon,
Here.
Floyd Canfield,
Here.
David Evans, Clinton Glick, Sheridan Little,
Here.
William Rezor,
Here.
Jeanette Seekin,
Here.
Rod Wagner, Todd Werblow here. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, do you want to call roll for your committee? Or have someone do it?
You have somebody, or do you want me to just use my phone here? I'll do it. Hang on.
You have a list?
I have a list.
Should be in this folder.
Yeah, it should be in the book.
Select one. Senator Guy.
Yeah.
Senator Cooper.
Here.
Senator Driscoll.
Used.
Senator Meyer. Excused. Senator Hester. He has to be excused. Senator Dockstetter.
I don't know, do you know?
I don't know. Usually he'll be here. Representative Blake. Here. Representative Eklund.
Here.
Representative Northrop. Representative Paxton.
Here.
Representative Hunt.
He'll be here.
Representative McKim. Here.
All right, thank you. All right, first on the agenda would be the Wyoming State Engineers Report.
No, we don't. Because we're just listening.
Harry?
Coming up, let me just let you know these placards or display boards that are in the room here. Those are past award-winning projects, engineering projects that have been received an award from the Wyoming Engineering Society. And in talking with one of their representatives, they asked if they couldn't display those here. I said, you know, we're going to have a large group of people here for the next 3 days. Bring them in. So that's why they're in the room, but take a few minutes, look at them. One of them is a water project. So they go through an annual competition every year, and this is just kind of a result of some of the projects around the state. So just take a look at them. And with that, Mr. Chairman, we have Steve Wolf and Chris Brown from the Attorney General's office, Steve from the State Engineer's office, and I will turn it over to them.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for the invite. As Harry said, my name is Steve Wolf. I'm in charge of the Interstate Streams Program with the Wyoming State Engineer's office. Chris Brown's with the Attorney General's office. Pat Terrell sends his regrets for not being able to be here today, but he had a scheduling conflict, so he sent the second team instead. If you remember, about a year ago, last fall, there was discussions by this commission about Colorado River compact apportionments, Wyoming's apportionments, and possibilities of leasing or selling water to downstream neighbors. I think Pat appeared before this commission and sort of said he did not think, he had some issues with that, didn't think it was a good idea. And in place of studying it, he offered to write a white paper on the topic to try and address that topic. We are here basically today to deliver that white paper. Here's the Colorado report. Chris just handed it out to each of you. I think we hope this report does at least 3 things for you. First, we hope it answers the questions that was brought up last fall during your discussions. Second, we want to highlight a lot of the issues that are ongoing in the Colorado River Basin and Wyoming's sort of role and responsibilities relative to those issues. So you all know it's a complex basin. There's a lot going on always, and it will probably get more intense in the coming years if we continue to suffer drought. And I think the third thing was to put all that into context. We needed to provide a lot of background about what are the laws and the doctrines that sort of govern water management on the river. So we've tried to provide, at least in a simple format, that background within this document. We're sorry we didn't get it to you sooner, that you'd have a chance to read it before this meeting. We hope you have a chance to read it in the coming weeks. And certainly Pat Terrell has offered that if you have any questions in the coming weeks, feel free to contact him. We'll try and answer any of your questions you have. Pat has also certainly offered to show up at your next meeting and entertain a discussion about this report at that point in time. We do also, other than the report, we also have some thumb drives on it that has a copy of the report and a lot of the background material that went into developing that report. We put it on thumb drives because if you print it all, it turns out and looks like this. So instead of doing that, we figured we'd just give it to you on the thumb drive. So.
Yeah, and that thumb drive is the appendices that are referenced at various portions, and actually the Law of the River portion of the report. And what's on the thumb drive are those elements of the Law of the River, those the ones that we have identified and spoken about in the Law of the River summary that's in the report. So if you want the 22 compact, the 48 compact, the various federal acts with regard to the river, that's what's on the thumb drive. And so I have them. Anybody that wants one, or everybody can have one.
Yeah, and rather than us try and go through the report with you page by page today, we figured we'd give you time to look at it, read it, develop your own questions. Chris and I will be around this afternoon and tomorrow morning. If you happen to look at it tonight and there's a specific question that comes up, please feel free to ask us tomorrow. But I think that's really about all we have to do today. Certainly happy to answer any questions you might have now.
And I want to emphasize something that Steve said. Our primary focus was to answer the very specific questions that we were discussing, and primarily Commissioner Reeser last, I think it was November, meeting when Mr. Terrell agreed to do this report. And so you see there's a very robust discussion, in my view, with regard to the marketing issue between the upper and lower basin, which otherwise wouldn't be in a report like this, but for your questions. And then the various other questions that you asked, you'll notice that we specifically call some of those out. And then variously, as we're talking about the Law of the River or current issues, talk about questions that you had as far as challenges, as far as outstanding issues, as far as common questions. So we tried to tailor it very specifically to answering the questions that you had. But in doing that, we had to provide a pretty comprehensive background with regard to the Law of the River that we hope is comprehensive enough to cover everything, but yet simple enough to understand. That was the balance that we tried to strike.
Right.
Questions? Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you just give us a 30,000 overview, 30,000 foot overview of the condition of Lake Mead, Glen Canyon, Flaming Gorge, Fonnell? Good.
Certainly. If you read this, you'll understand that the 2007 interim guidelines sort of dictate how Powell and Mead are operated sort of in concert with each other. They try and keep them basically at the same level. In spite of that, we deliver 9 million acre feet on average downstream right now to Lake Mead, and it continues to drop. If forecasts go as predicted, it will be under what's called a tier 1 shortage as of January 1st of 2018, so just a little over a year from now. If that happens, which is an elevation of 1075, the lower basin will be in a tier 1 shortage condition. They will be taking cuts, which means state of Arizona takes cuts, Nevada takes cuts, California does not take any cuts at tier 1. So that's how things stand now. There is a lot of effort throughout the basin, both upper and lower, to write drought contingency plans. Within the lower basin drought plan, they are trying to sort of modify how some of those shortages may or may be taken. Sort of parallel to that, we're in discussions with the Republic of Mexico and trying to get sort of buy-in on shortages on their side if things continue to get worse. So there's a lot of activities ongoing currently. A lot of those are addressed in here. I talked about the issues in the basin. A lot of the drought planning and drought operations and things like that are talked about, at least at a 30,000 foot level in here. So it would give you an idea of ongoing things.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions, comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Beckman.
as we put water down the river that exceeds what we're required to put down, water that we could be, if we put it to beneficial use in Wyoming, we could keep it. As we put it down the river, if it's my understanding, we're credited with that water. How long down, I mean, how many years do they keep track of that credit to Wyoming, and will it make any difference if the level, I'm not sure I understand, if the level goes down too far, then what goes on?
I think there's two issues you're talking about.
Yep.
Within Wyoming, we have a certain apportionment within the compacts that we can use, put to beneficial use within Wyoming. We currently don't use all that apportionment. What we don't use does go on downstream and becomes available to anybody downstream. That's the way the beneficial use thing. There is a component relative to the upper basin and lower basin deliveries, where the upper basin can't cause the flow of the river to drop below 75 million acre feet in a 10-year running period. That's kind of the measure under the compact. So when we release more than that, more than 7.5 a year on average, we get credit on that end. The upper basin gets credit, and it is continually tallied. Our 10-year running average currently is right at 90 million acre feet. So we're not very close to having any compact issues with the lower basin. We're fairly safe right now. So again, there's a Wyoming component, there's an upper basin, lower basin component. I hope that answered your question.
Good. The follow-up though.
Ed?
You also mentioned Mexico, and apparently we might be shorting them, and I can see that happening, shorting Mexico in this compact. My understanding is Mexico is shorting us on the Rio Grande. They're taking more water than they should be taking. Is there any balance out in two different watersheds like that? Or
The first part, our treaty with Mexico says we deliver 1.5 million acre feet to them every year, and we have done that every year.
okay.
There is a part in the treaty that says under extraordinary drought, they will take a shortage. But that term extraordinary drought has never been defined what it means. But as we write new minutes to the treaty, which are sort of amendments or changes to the treaty, and we're currently working on right now, we're looking at and them agreeing to take shortages, just as the lower basin state take shortages under the tier 1 and tier 2 shortages under the interim guidelines. So we're right now working out a plan where Mexico will take shortage. Relative to the Rio Grande, although both of those things are in the same treaty, the international treaty covers both the Colorado, the Tijuana, and the Rio Grande rivers. There is no connection as if they short us on the Rio Grande, we're going to pay them back on the Colorado. And we hope it never gets that way. On the Colorado River, we all get along very, very well, and we work out our problems. So we don't have those issues. And we don't want to get them mixed up in another river basin if we don't have to.
Thank you.
Senator Cooper. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I've always been curious about over the years that 10 years or so that I've served on this Select Water Committee is, as I recall, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but storage for drought is really not considered a beneficial use as I remember. In other words, you can't just say, hey, we want to store a bunch of water in case there's going to be a drought, say in the upper basin versus the lower basin. Is there been any consideration within the compact at all, any discussion of the fact that there is a certain amount of water storage that could be considered as future beneficial use or anything like that? Is there, maybe you can set me straight on that, but I'm just a little concerned because of all this water that we're actually at this time sending down the Green River into the Colorado that was by compact is basically our water, but at this point we're not using it. So it'd be nice to be able to store some. But anyway, would you just kind of discuss that a little bit for us?
Mr. Chairman, I will start, and I'm sure Chris will chime in on this one. True. Storage in itself is not a beneficial use. And so you can't store it and just hold on to it if you don't need it. In Wyoming and with all the upper basin states, but specifically in Wyoming, we've had discussions in the last couple of years and sort of diagnose the problem of should we do something just what you're talking about? Have some storage accounts. Fontenelle or Flaming Gorge with reclamation, and we term it system water, but basically be able to store water and hold it there in case we owe more water downstream, in case of drought, to try and keep our water users whole in case we do hit a curtailment, that we could use that water to pay downstream demands and not have to turn any of our upper basin or our water users off. So we're having those discussions. We think there's a lot of opportunities there. We've talked to reclamation about trying to set up this accounting system, and I think they are agreeable to continue to discuss the issue. It would probably take some legislative changes in our water laws, some tweaks at least. But yeah, we think we'll be there. I think we need it, and we're working towards that right now. But I'll let Chris address it as well.
It's a tough question because you need to answer it, in my view, in relation to other water rights as well, which is not always the easiest thing to do when you start talking about the Colorado River, because there's so many different things at play. And one thing I would suggest that there are different elements of the law of the river, of which Wyoming is adopted as statute, of which Congress is adopted as federal statute, which the states have all agreed to. For example, the Colorado River Storage Project Act, which allowed for construction of the initial units and then participating units, of which Fontenelle and Flaming Gorge and Aspinall and Navajo and Lake Powell itself are all a part of. And within those documents, which, like I said, is a Wyoming statute, allow for the purpose of that project to be both for upper basin development so that we can use our apportionment and for compliance with the 1922 compact. So I would suggest that baked in to both the legislative approval and, in fact, the water rights that were originally granted from those states, for example, Flaming Gorge is a Utah water right, identify specifically the purpose of that project. And so for those, I think one could make a pretty strong argument that part of the beneficial use is not the storage of water, but for the purpose of accomplishing upper basin development in compliance with the 1922 compact.
To follow up, Mr. Chairman, on that. And, this is a point I think that the late Dan Budd would point, who I know you recognize here in your report, would talk about, because, storage in the upper basin could also be beneficial to the lower basin states in the future. If there is a call on the river, then there is ready amount of available water for them. But of course, then they may argue the point, well, then we can't use it now. We have to wait for a future call. So that's the point of discussion. Maybe I wonder if it's ever gone into that point where do the lower basin states consider the fact that maybe if we allow the upper basin states to store some water as a beneficial use for storage only, that it could be beneficial to them in the future. Is any discussion going on about that?
I think so. I mean, the lower basin does it now in something called intentionally created surplus. They retain water in storage for future uses. It was part of the interim guidelines. Certainly possible that the upper basin could look in doing something similar in those upper basin reservoirs. So, and of course, Lake Powell is our savings account. It sits at the bottom of our system. Once it hits to Lake Powell, it's not much use to the upper basin, except to provide the water deliveries for the compact that we have to downstream, provides a lot of hydropower, and we benefit from the financial resources that's generated from that hydropower. So those are sort of the three big benefits from Lake Powell we get.
And for all intents and factors, actually, once it hits Flaming Gorge, it's not much use to Wyoming anymore. I mean, other than recreation possibly.
That's absolutely true. Huge recreation benefit, but from a water perspective, unless you're going to pump it.
Yeah, it's too far downhill. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's right, Mr. Chairman. I think just to expand on that a little bit, I'd suggest that there's already some of what you're talking about baked into the process through the 68 Colorado River Basin Project Act, which requires the Secretary of the Interior to consider various things in determining what they call 602A storage. And part of that is both compliance with the 1922 compact, which is the 75 and 10-year non-depletion obligation. And part of that is also being able to develop in the upper basin, but balancing all those things. So when the Bureau comes up with its annual operating plans, it takes into consideration hydrology and the amount of storage necessary in order to allow the upper basin to continue complying with the compact and put to beneficial use the water that it's apportioned. So both the ability for the upper basin to use the water and continuing compact compliance by keeping storage upstream is already taken into consideration in that process.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. I was going to follow up on that point because, I mean, under the 68 Act, Glen Canyon Dam really is stored water for the purpose of delivering water from the upper basin, lower basin. So couldn't storage in Fontenelle be just a parallel of that, where we're storing water as one of the upper basin states for when there's a call, Wyoming has to deliver its portion. So we are using Fontenelle the same way the whole upper basin uses Glen Canyon.
I think that's a possibility that we've discussed, at least for the amount of water in Fontenelle that is, Harry's account.
Right.
In that's not already contracted under a service contract. There is available water to do something like that with.
But if we increase the storage there, we can increase that account that is available for drought delivery.
Absolutely. And I think that's the way we've expressed it. If that project goes forward, we'd like to see it to retain at least a portion of that for these drought-related needs or water use protections. So,
and Mr. Chairman, if I could add on to that a little bit. I think you'll find probably both Harry, but I know for certain the state engineer, when talking about the proposed legislation with regard to enlargement of at least the usable active space in Fontenelle, he has suggested that is the very purpose for which we're seeking, if not the only purpose, at least the primary purpose for which we'd be seeking, is to allow more flexibility with regard to the protection of Wyoming water usage should the time come that we would have to curtail for purposes of complying with the 22 compact. So what you're suggesting is exactly what we're exploring.
and Mr. Chairman, understanding that Fontenelle solution is a short-term solution. It may get us out of a 2-year, maybe a 3-year period, but it's not going to hold us, whole forever.
Sure. Another, in some of the sort of experimental things that have been done over the last decade or so on the Colorado, like the high flow experiments, when that water is released from Glen Canyon Dam, that still counts as part of the upper basin delivering to the lower basin. But on the other hand, we're losing some of our ability to create hydropower, which, if I remember right, is a secondary use, but still a purpose of that dam.
Yes.
When that went into effect, the upper basin states in a way are losing part of their income from their cash register. To put that into effect, did the Bureau of Reclamation have to get all 7 states to agree to that, or do they just do that unilaterally?
Mr. Chairman, all 7 states are certainly involved in those discussions. There's a high flow event going on right now. It started Sunday night and will go through tomorrow evening, I guess. But you're correct. They went to back up. These high flow events are really to move sediment downstream, build sandbars that are important to a lot of the recreation of the rafting community. And so they've done them, I don't know, they've probably done 10 or 12 in the last 15 years or so. It takes a lot of water. The amount of that water is accounted to the upper basin state, so it's not like we're losing that. But water is bypassed from the hydro facility, so we lose hydropower and we lose dollars. But there is, in the current document that operates those, all 7 basin states are consulted, and we have to basically agree to them. There's a new EIS out on the whole operation of Glen Canyon Dam called LTEMP, which will be, the record decision will probably be signed next month. There is a very formalized consultation process, or I won't use the word consultation, he doesn't like that word, but there's a formalized process of how the federal government and the Park Service and the states talk, and Fish and Wildlife, on how these operate. We probably can't stop them, but we do get say-so in how and when they occur.
Sure. But what I want to see is that's an example of something that was not contemplated in any of the river compacts, but is a new use of water on the Colorado River for frankly a new kind of benefit that no one thought of in 1922.
Where most of that came from is because of the Glen Canyon or the Grand Canyon Protection Act, which was 1992. So there's a lot of things relative to that new law that does sort of alter some of the water management activities. But really, the compacts talk about volumes of annual deliveries, and none of that's ever been changed or violated. And like you said, the hydropower is a secondary thing.
Yeah. So, but my point is when we get to the idea of Wyoming trying to get new kinds of benefits out of its water, such as some kind of lease or some kind of delivery, or just even if it's an agreement to release water where we technically have no control, but it's a practice that goes down the river and creates certain benefits. If that can be done for the high flow experiments, because everybody signs off on it, I would think you could have everybody sign off on the same thing being done, whether it's a high flow experiment or some other purpose, even though it's not a present use considered under the compact. All I'm getting at is if you can create flexibility because of Grand Canyon Protection Act and change the way, you're not changing the basic part of the compact, but you're changing when and how it's delivered to meet certain new public desires. Couldn't Wyoming try to benefit from that flexibility if it sees an opportunity?
Mr. Chair, I'll let Chris answer in a second because I know he's chomping a bit. My argument would be you would be changing, when you're talking about water, you are changing the basic tenets of the compact versus hydropower, which is not part of the compact. So there are some very fundamental hurdles with it, I think, that are talked about in the compact when you're talking about leasing water downstream. But I'd let Chris.
And I'm not sure I'm fully wrapping my brain around what you're talking about, but I think I understand. And what I would suggest is, especially the Grand Canyon Protection Act doesn't provide flexibility; it provides constraints. And it, much like the Endangered Species Act, provides constraints on the ability to develop into the future. And if we didn't comply with or satisfy, or whatever word you want to use, especially the Endangered Species Act, but also the Grand Canyon Protection Act, if we didn't satisfy those things, then the ability for Wyoming to develop in the future could be hampered somehow. And so what you're suggesting is getting some benefit out of it. I think we are. And especially when you're talking about the Endangered Species Act, you're trying to, while also satisfying our obligations under the 22 Compact, which is just the 75 and 10-year obligation, while satisfying that as well, allowing for the addressing of resources at the same time so that you don't incur additional constraints on our ability to develop upstream. So I would suggest to you under those things, we already do get benefit.
What I'm trying to do is I agree. I think the deliveries through the high flow experiments, for example, have helped satisfy the Endangered Species Act, so reduce the likelihood of future restrictions on our use. So it's a very good program. But what I'm saying is that was done because everybody agreed to do it. And it doesn't change the delivery. The water being delivered is still the same based on the 22 Compact. So I'm just, and so the loss there was the loss of hydropower. So it's a cash loss, but not a change in the compact itself. I'm just saying that it was probably from Fontenelle, where we own the water. If we were to have some agreement there that met certain, helped out with endangered species, let's say in Dinosaur National Monument, let's say there was a Dinosaur National Monument Protection Act. As long as those deliveries still were counted and as part of the compact, I think Wyoming should be looking for ways to benefit. Either it's getting paid to do that, or it's retaining flexibility on use of the water by doing that. So I'm just saying, use the operation of Glen Canyon Dam and all the changes over the last 2 decades that are creating new public benefits from that water without changing the actual deliveries, just changing when they're done and how they're done. I think we can do the same and get where we're benefiting the state of Wyoming in comparison to all the other upper basin states.
I understand your point. I guess I would apply that. Remember, there's a great big reservoir, Flaming Gorge, right below Fontenelle, that has all the water in the world, that they pretty much operate it for endangered fish and other recreational flows downstream. So currently, there's sort of not a demand for that public interest flows from Flaming Gorge. I think they kind of get what they want as is because there's no demands on Flaming Gorge. Not to say that's always going to stay the same. I think we look at it that Fontenelle water, I mean, as we move forward and if we continue to see drought, can really be used in ways to protect Wyoming water users, just as system water to move downstream on any deliveries that Wyoming may need to make.
Sure. No, I'm agreeing completely
Okay.
with that, and the situation is slightly different with the two dams and all. But my point is, if you go back 30 years, no one foresaw the high flow experiments as a public benefit. And so, what new public benefit that Wyoming can benefit from is unforeseen at this point. And so what I'm saying is, yes, increase the storage in Fontenelle and retain it for drought delivery, but it may be that we get some other benefits out of it too.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, I agree with that. I think we have found a lot of flexibility in how to operate the Colorado River for a whole variety of reasons over the last 15 years. And I think we will continue to see more of that. I think we don't want to get to a point where we have to really be messing with the compacts because that's where everybody gets scared. So there's a lot of flexibility we found and that will continue, I would say.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Looks like none.
Thank you for your time. Again, if you have any questions, hopefully you'll look at the report. Feel free to contact Pat Terrell. And if anybody wants a thumb drive with
you can't go anywhere in our state, at least where there's forests, and not be impacted visually by the bark beetles. No, it's a very big outbreak. It has a lot of implications, and so we put together a large team to address this. So there was quite a few students and postdocs that were funded by this, a variety of colleagues here in the region, but also around the country. And then finally, it took a lot of money to do this as well. And so some of this money came directly from the Water Development Commission to the Office of Water Programs. We also got some money from McIntyre Stennis. We used that as a seed, and we got some money from the National Science Foundation, both their hydrology and EPSCoR program. There's over $20 million of federal funds that have gone into researching the water of the state, and these seeds that you provided were a key part of that. So we talk about the bark beetles. They get all the press, and indeed they're certainly important, but the real assassin here is what's called blue stain fungus. So there's these pockets on the head of the beetle, and they carry spores, and when they go to the tree and they bore in to lay eggs, they pass these spores into the tree, and it colors the sapwood where the tree is conducting water. So the fungus plugs up those pipes, or it causes the tree to have a wound response, and essentially it's like a massive drought. So the tree can't pull up water from the soil, and it dies. So here's some pictures. So this is the crest of the Snowy Range west of Laramie. So this is a native beetle. There's always a few trees dying from it. Usually they're ones that have been hit by lightning or they're stressed in some way. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, droughts especially increased the population of beetles, and they were able to attack healthy trees. And so a few years later, we have over 80% mortality of the canopy trees. So we wanted to know, what does this do to the water cycle? So when I wrote the proposals for this, I wanted to know how much more water we would get as a result of the beetles. And the idea here is that the trees are using a whole lot of water. And so if we cut off that water, there should be more of the precipitation that ends up in all the subsurface and surface flows, and we end up with more stream flow. So as an example, an average high elevation water budget for our area, about 1 meter, 1,000 millimeters for precip, most of which is snow. Evapotranspiration, that's this water that goes back to the atmosphere. The trees are doing a whole lot of that. That's almost half the precip. So a bunch of our water goes back, and as I'll show you a little later, a whole bunch of this is actually snow sublimation, which is a new finding. Then we get up with a little less than half of our precip is available for stream flow, and then this little leftover, that's things like groundwater recharge, soil recharge, those kinds of things. So we put out a series of hypotheses, and what we said was, if you have this initial conditions of a forest, so this forest has been growing, say it's 100, 200 years old, and you kill trees with bark beetles, the transpiration of the trees goes down within a few weeks. So within a few days after the bark beetles hit trees, we can actually measure that the flow rate of water in the trees goes down. It happens really rapidly as that fungus spreads. As soon as that water goes down, it becomes available in the soil. So within months, we've got soil moisture that's available. Any of that extra soil moisture, it's possible that that could end up then in streams as well. So we would predict that within months, you should start to see some additional stream flow. Now, as the stands start to open up and the needles fall off, we get more radiation, more wind penetration, so evaporation will go up, snow sublimation will go up. And then we predicted that within decades, all this would go back as the forest grew back and went through succession. This paper was completely non-controversial. So we formulated these hypotheses based on timber harvesting and fire data, and just said, we think the same principles will apply for bark beetles. So one of the key measurements that we're making is what's called eddy covariance, and this allows us to directly measure the evapotranspiration. Now, normally in hydrology, we can measure precipitation and storage of various components in the stream flow, and then we get the evapotranspiration as a residual. It's almost like the error term that's left over, but in this case, we can measure it directly. This is very useful in the bark beetles because that's what we hypothesize is their biggest impact. So imagine this plane that's above the forest, and every 20 times a second, we're measuring the three-dimensional wind speed. And at the same time, we're measuring the water vapor concentration, also CO2, but for our purposes, water vapor concentration. So we know the net exchange of water vapor, and we sum that up every 30 minutes, and we can sum it up over days, years, and decades. So the two sites that we've done a lot of intensive measurements are down here in southeast Wyoming. So one called Glees. This is all in the Medicine Bow National Forest. This is in a fairly high elevation spruce fir stand. We often hear about mountain pine beetle. The spruce beetle has been killing a lot of our spruce trees. There's also fir beetles as well. And then we have Chimney Park, which is a mid-elevation lodgepole pine forest. So this series of data, I just want to show that we have a very long record. So every one of these is a year. So we go from 2002 to 2014. This is 12 years of data. And in 2008 is when the Forest Service really considered the epidemic was reaching its peak. It kept going through this forest through about 2012. The y-axis of each one of these is the carbon dioxide exchange, and the x-axis is the water exchange. Now, why do we care about carbon dioxide and hydrology? Well, the only reason the trees lose all this water is because they want to take up carbon dioxide, and they can't do it without opening these little pores called stomates that allow the CO2 to go in, but then they lose a ton of water. This is the whole reason we have to irrigate, is because the plants use a ton of water to do photosynthesis. So the relationship between this tells us how well the forest is doing. This red line is known as the water use efficiency. How much biomass do we get as a result of losing water? So if you notice, this line looks very similar until we get here. So this is 2 years after the bark beetles have really started hitting this forest, and you can see the relationship looks different. This exactly fits our hypotheses that I showed earlier. The trees are behaving exactly as we predicted. We published some papers on that. But then things get a little strange. They're back the next year in 2011. And after that, we see a full recovery of the exchange of this forest. So the recovery looks a whole lot faster than we initially hypothesized. So here's some more data. This is the vertical exchange of water vapor. So this is a eddy covariance tower over a forest that's not been hit by bark beetles. This is one that's been hit by bark beetles. And so these are 3 different years. So you can see there's variation in the amount of water vapor that goes back to the atmosphere. If we look at these 3 years, this is an impacted site, and notice that the evapotranspiration goes up. This is exactly counter to what we predicted. At first you would go, this must be a measurement error, but stream flow, which is here, goes in exactly the same direction as what you would expect if we increase the evapotranspiration. We get less stream flow. And if we look at the exchange of the amount of carbon dioxide that's coming in and water vapor, the water use efficiency of this forest stays the same this whole time. It tells us that the biology of the forest, its productivity is staying very similar. So why might that be? So then we also want to know, well, are we seeing this in other watersheds? So that one that I just showed you is just that small watershed that we've been doing in southeast Wyoming. Here's a series of 8 watersheds along the Continental Divide in kind of the center of Colorado. They have a lot longer record than we do of the watersheds we were working in. So these are the 8 watersheds. The black line is before bark beetles. So this is a record, depending on the watershed, between 20 and 40 years of data. The red line is during and after bark beetles. And this is anywhere from about 5 to 12 years. The green over here is a watershed that was never impacted by beetles. So first thing to note is there's not a lot of difference between these. So they have a much longer data record than what we had in our small watersheds. And they're seeing something very similar, not much impact. The analysis here, though, is to look at what's called a double mass plot. So what they're doing is they're taking the accumulation of the control. So this watershed that was not impacted by bark beetles, it's sitting amongst these other watersheds. What is its accumulated flow? And then looking at the bark beetle impacted ones. If there is a significant change, there's an arrow associated with it. So notice that out of the 8 watersheds, one of them shows a significant increase after bark beetles. One of them shows a significant decrease after bark beetles, and all of the other 6 show no change. So the big take-home message from this is there is not a consistent increase in stream flow after bark beetles from 8 watersheds in Colorado, showing the same thing that we saw in southern Wyoming. And this information here is summarizing these 8 watersheds. So this is a double mass approach. This is a separate analysis. This is the change in stream flow, where you can either use the double mass, which is the gray analysis, a runoff ratio, how much runoff do you get compared to precipitation, or a time series analysis where you try to take out the changing in climate variability signal. And so notice, if the hypothesis that bark beetles would increase stream flow, we should see all these bark beetle impacted watersheds showing significant up bars with little asterisks above them. There's only one, that one right there. All the rest of them with these 3 analyses are either showing no change or in some cases a decrease in stream flow like we saw here in Wyoming. So you may go, well, maybe southern Wyoming and central Colorado are just anomalous. We just got some weird results here. So a paper just came out a few months ago looking at 33 watersheds across basically the western US where bark beetles are located. Notice this includes any of these red are the watersheds. This is Colorado, Wyoming, Black Hills, northwestern Wyoming, northeastern Utah, all up along the greater Yellowstone and up into Montana and Idaho, and even along the Cascades and these coastal ranges. 33 watersheds, no significant change in peak flows, base flows, or average daily stream flow in any of them. And climate variability overwhelming what's happening from the bark beetles. So If you get more snow, you get more stream flow. If you get less snow, you get less stream flow, and temperature playing a secondary role. Why? Why is this happening? When you run standard hydrologic models or any of these watersheds, they all predict an increase in stream flow. So I was taking a hike a couple of years ago, and I noticed this patch. So if you notice, there's about 8 dead trees up here. And right below those 8 dead trees is this green patch. So when you walk around in lodgepole pine that's intact, it's like a biological desert in the understory. There's nothing there. But where these dead trees are located, there's a patch of saplings coming in and a whole lot of shrubs and grass. In fact, in those watersheds that we're working in southern Wyoming, now that the trees have died, we have all this understory coming in, and you get elk and moose, even up into the forests. And the reason for that is that we're getting this incredible regrowth of tree seedlings and understory vegetation. So this is time since infestation, so looking at 5 years. This is the amount of live basal area, so you can see that the basal area declined. We had this is understory vegetation. We went from about 0, which is typical for these forests, to almost 50% ground cover. This is an amazing amount of growth of understory vegetation that is occurring here. And it's happening really fast. And in fact, in a lot of these cases, we're seeing 20 to 30,000 seedlings of trees coming in at the same time. This is within 3 to 5 years. Remember, the hypothesis was decades for recovery to happen. This is the water-filled pore space in the soil. So the only way we're going to get extra stream flow is if we get increased soil moisture. We do get increased soil moisture for 2 years. And then by the time we get back to years 3, 4, and 5, we're back to where we started. And that's because all this new vegetation and some of the residual trees, the bark beetles never kill off everybody. It's taking up that additional soil moisture. And that's why we're not getting the stream flow. Now, another thing to consider is that this is a patchy situation. So when we say a watershed has 80% mortality in it, it didn't happen in 1 year. On average, it takes 5. So each patch that dies, you've got a clock that starts ticking. So within 3 to 5 years, we've got recovery of that soil moisture. By the time this patch is 5 years old, I've got recovery. I may have another patch that's hit by beetles right next to it. It's got a different clock and maybe a year or 2 behind. So by the time I get to the whole 80% mortality of the whole watershed, it's all gotten mixed together. You don't get all of that water in one shot. Another part of this story is the winter. So this is 10 years of data from our high elevation eddy covariance tower. So this is the month of the water year from October to October. This blue that you see here is the average start and stop of snowpack. So we usually get snowpack sometime in late October, early November, and this year it might be January, I'm not sure. But then usually it's gone in June to July. This yellow and black line is the average daily air temperature. So here's 0, so you can see during the wintertime it's below freezing, and then it gets warm in the summertime. This line right here is the accumulation of water vapor flux over the whole year. So notice that from October to June, we get this constant increase, and then in June, it increases. So the rate of accumulation is increasing. This is when all the trees turn on and the growing season starts. You get more water vapor. But all of this right here, notice it's really cold. We're getting a whole bunch of water vapor going into the atmosphere. That's sublimation. And sublimation accounts for somewhere between 30%, and that's if we're really conservative and we say it has to be below freezing and there has to be snow. If we use that as our criteria, 30% of the total annual water vapor flux is sublimation. If we just say at the same time snow is present, it's 50%. This is an enormous number. Nobody's model accounts for that right now. And we're starting to see a lot of other publications since we put this out and go, oh yeah, we're seeing a lot of sublimation also. And one thing to note here, we don't have any idea if you enhance snowfall with cloud seeding, what does it do to sublimation? Is it proportional? Is some other change happening? We don't know. We don't know the answer. We just know there's a whole lot of water vapor that goes up in the wintertime. Our models do a pretty good job right now of this portion with the change that I'll show you. So this is a a webcam of our high elevation site during and right after a snowstorm. So here snow's falling, and you can see the trees are accumulating snow in their canopies. This is right afterwards. We're back to blue sky. So this is about 12 hours afterwards. This is 24 hours afterwards. Notice we've already lost a lot of snow in the canopy, and within 48 hours, it's all gone. It's really hard to capture this amount of snow that's in the canopy. And in fact, NCAR and Boulder has been trying to do this by looking at how the vibrational frequency of trees change. And it does not calibrate very well at all to mass measurements, where you cut a tree off and just measure the change in mass over time. So we don't have a very good estimate of getting this interception of snow besides measuring an open area for snowfall and under the forest. But our Wyoming winds make that comparison between those two really challenging. Developed a model to try to tease this apart. So here's a tree, and imagine snowfall happening. And what we want to know is, well, what's the total amount of water vapor that goes back up to the atmosphere during the winter? And we do it as a series of resistors. So you can imagine if I want to move water from a snowpack into the atmosphere, it's going to depend on how much radiation is available, how much wind to turbulence is available, and then what is the resistance to moving that up back into the atmosphere. And so basically we're solving this resistance network every 30 minutes with our data, and we're testing whether our physical model of how the water vapor is going back up in the atmosphere works. So this is just a couple-week period in 2015, early winter, where there's several snow events. So the top line right here, this is what we call latent energy. This is the sublimation of snow. It's too cold for it to be evaporating. The dots that are here, the black dots, this is the measurement from our plane, the eddy covariance. The red is our modeled sublimation if we include the loss of canopy from bark beetles. We're using the very same statistics that you might have heard from this site called 538. It's Bayesian statistics. Nate Silver, he predicts politics and all sorts of things. He was the only prediction that gave Trump any chance at all of winning the election. In fact, he gave him a 45% chance. So we're using a very similar type of statistical analysis here. And so this is showing that we're predicting the sublimation quite well if we include the outbreak. If we say there's no outbreak, notice we way overestimate the sublimation here. At the same time, the model independently predicts what's called the sensible heat flux. This is the other part of the energy balance, and it nails that really well also. So these two lines give us a lot of confidence that we're getting the physics of the snow sublimation right. And the reason we're doing a good job with that, this is an estimate of the massive snow in the canopy. Remember, we can't measure that very well, so we asked the model, tell us what it is. And so when the snow events happen, it accumulates snow mass, and then it sublimates away. And you can see the red is from the outbreak, and the blue is if there's no outbreak. If there's no outbreak, there's more canopy. It holds on to more snow and intercepts it through sublimation. So the take-home message here is that when you see these larger sublimation events, this is all because it's recently snowed. So most of our sublimation is coming from the canopy and not the snowpack within these forests. And here are the different simulations. If we said there is absolutely no bark beetles whatsoever, it would be this blue line would be the accumulated sublimation. This red line is the best estimate, and it includes the canopy and the snowpack. And this is the one that matches the data really well. These green lines and orange lines are if we said it was only coming from the pack itself and not from the canopy. And notice we're really far off there. So you got to get the canopy right, and you got to drag the pack along as well. But the message here is that sublimation matters. It's a gigantic amount of our water budget, and it's very dynamic. It changes as a result of the bark beetles. So there's over a 30% drop in sublimation as a result of the bark beetles. And remember that cloud seeding amount is 5-6% or so. So this is creating a gigantic amount of uncertainty right now that we've got to get our heads around.
Can I ask a question? Go ahead. Is it all right if I interrupt you to ask? I just go ahead, because before you get too far off this. Okay, from what I know from walking in the forest in the winter at various times for hunting or whatever, sometimes we have a real, the sun comes out and radiates and begins to melt the snow on the canopies.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, towards the evening, it just freezes. The temperature drops precipitously, and all of a sudden, you freeze. Is that kind of accounted for in this model somehow? Because sometimes that stays on those needles in that canopy for days, because now it takes a lot longer to melt that down. If you thought, was that considered at all, or how did that?
Yeah, so if you go back to that resistance
Right,
network.
that's what I was thinking.
So this part right here is called a variable resistor. It changes with the massive snow that's. When you get that little residual amount of snow that's left and it's frozen, you'll still have some, but the resistance goes way up because you got this ice layer on there. So that uncertainty gets carried forward in the model. It's one of the reasons it's hard to see in this figure, but the red has a width to it, right? So that's this uncertainty that we're carrying forward. So the way that we analyze it is we said, well, within the uncertainty, we're capturing more than 90% of the data. You know, there's a few points that we miss. We don't get every single. So the other part that I don't talk about here is that we have things like these ice lenses that form. We also have other components of what we call advection. So what happens if you're bringing in dry air from some new air mass and moving it over? And then we ask the model, do we need all that complexity or not? Because you can keep putting in more and more things in the model, which gives you more and more levers to try to fit data. But we penalize ourselves every time we add another one in there. So it turns out that the ice part that you talk about, it may be a physical process, but it's a complexity, probably because we don't have enough data to justify it. The model says you don't need.
Well, it's probably an occasional thing too. It's not like a constant.
Right. So over an entire winter, maybe that has a 3 to 5% impact. Our model's not going to get that kind of accuracy right now.
Thank you.
Last thing, so that was the winter part. We also want to improve our predictions of the growing season component. So this model is called TREES, the Terrestrial Regional Ecosystem Exchange Simulator. It basically does hydrology, but it includes a whole bunch of ecology like tree growth and also succession afterwards. So the way that we set up this model is that we said, well, first of all, we want to get the tree mortality correct. And so this is a simulation of the black line here is the drop in the ability of the tree to move water due to that blue stain fungus. And so we set up the blue stain based on a growing degree day for beetle eruption. And we set it up based on the temperature response of the fungus in terms of the growth rate. And so this is a growing season here of about 50 days. The points are actual measurements. So every point here is a set of trees that are either not hit by beetles, 5 not hit by beetles in relation to 5 that are. And so this 1 would be at the beginning, the 5 trees not hit by beetles and the ones that are going to be hit by beetles are the same because they haven't been attacked yet. So you can see they get attacked here and then their ability to move water declines and the model picks that up really well. It hits the data almost exactly. So then we can simulate the total summer evapotranspiration. So this is a 4-year period where we went from about 30% mortality here to about 80% mortality here. The green is the amount of evapotranspiration coming from live trees. The red is the ones that are dying in that particular growing season. The brown are the dead trees. So remember the branches are still going to get some water on them, intercept it, and throw it back to the atmosphere. And then the blue is the new part of our model. This is the regenerating forest. So no one else's model does this right now, this regeneration. And so if you notice, we went through this massive mortality. The total amount of evapotranspiration is not changing a whole lot. This change that you see here is due to years or time. You get less evapotranspiration, years or time. If we remove this regeneration part, notice we would have a whole lot less evapotranspiration. The model would then take all that water and stick it in the streams. And that's what most standard models do right now. It's incorrect. You've got to get this regeneration right. So our final test of this, we go back to our data. So this is those same years. So we went from 30% mortality to 80% mortality. Each point here is a half hour during the growing season of water vapor flux. So the y-axis is the simulation from the model, and the x-axis, the y-axis is the observed, and the dashed line is the one-to-one. So the more the points are on the one-to-one, the better the model is doing. This is an extremely rigorous test. Most people do this on a weekly, monthly, sometimes annual basis. We're at 30 minutes to make sure our processes is right. And we're doing a pretty good job. We're explaining at least 70% of the data in all cases. And this is all the years together. So in order to get this right, you had to have the regeneration in there. And that's what's explaining the lack of water going back into our streams, is the fact that the forest recovers faster than we predicted in our original hypotheses based on clear cutting, timber harvesting, and fire. So what we learned from all this, so at the tree level, we understand pretty well what these bark beetles are doing. There's no controversy there. At the stand level, we understand it pretty well, but it's happening much faster. The alleviation, the regeneration happens much faster than we thought, on the order of 3 to 5 years rather than decades. We got to think about sublimation. This is an important process in our forest, even without bark beetles. It's substantial, 30 to 50% of the total water vapor flux. And really, in the end, bark beetles play a whole lot less role in forest water yield than anyone thought. In fact, some of those early papers that we wrote were really hard to publish because no one believed it. But now people are seeing it all over the continent. They're seeing it in Canada as well. It's consistent. No one is seeing a significant impact of bark beetles on stream flow. And so what this illustrates is that we have knowledge gaps in our stream flow prediction. We didn't know this until we went out and took the measurements, and then we could improve our models. So we have to be careful. You can't predict stream flow just by snow water equivalent and evapotranspiration. You got to get the vegetation dynamics right as well. So thanks for your time, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Representative
Thank you. So I guess a question I would have here is, instead of just not managing the forest and allowing the bark beetles to run their course, wouldn't we be better off managing the forest like we used to with logging industry, and then knowing how to reforest the area? Because that's part of what's going to increase the stream flow as well, and the cycle of things. I guess I don't understand. In the mid-90s, they took away with rules and regs, took away the logging industry in Wyoming. And now the pine beetles are doing that job. And wouldn't this support the idea that the logging industry was much more important than we thought?
Let me take you through my education as a forester long ago. So when I was learning, one of the things we talked about was that if you want to prevent bark beetles, the best thing to do is thin a stand and make really big trees, because they grow better, they have much better defenses. And in the 80s, there's a ton of information that said that was exactly what you did. So forest management was a prescription to help prevent bark beetles. And that is definitely true under what we call endemic conditions. So the times in which bark beetles are kind of at a background level. What happened, there's a couple things that happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. So first of all, our forests got to an optimal age and size. And this is due to westward expansion from the 19th century. We have a lot of forests that were 120, 200 years old. That's an optimal size for bark beetles. They have kind of this search image that they go out. So that was one problem. Second problem is that we had droughts. And so even if I have a nice big tree that should have a lot of defenses, if I have a drought, its defense capabilities will go down. So the beetle population started building up. So even when the droughts were alleviated, let's say I have a tree that has the amount of pitch that can get rid of 1,000 beetles. So we can make 1,000 of those little pitch outs. If it gets hit by 10,000 beetles, it doesn't matter. So once the epidemic got rolling because of the drought and we had a whole bunch of forests of the appropriate size, it didn't matter what we did, those trees were going to get hit by beetles. And the beetle epidemic went away because they ran out of suitable trees. So my recommendation is that we need a lot of different ages and sizes of trees, which would be due to forest management. So if we do nothing now, we're going to end up with the same problem our great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren in another century, century and a half, when the forests come back and they're all in the same size again.
Oh, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm going to counter that a little bit, because we have the Black Hills It's mostly private land, and it's mostly healthy forest. We are fighting pine beetles there, but because of a rigorous management plan that's been going on, it didn't stop in the 90s. We've continued to have loggers there managing that forest. You can look on the map, and it's this big green area where you'll have little bitty patches of beetle infestation. Most of them are on federal land and wilderness areas. So I'm still saying, I think you're with me on the idea that we need to have, in order to have healthy forests, healthy streams and whatnot, we probably are going to have to manage the forests. But I'm not sure that where we are managing the forests, they are healthy. And I think we can do that statewide. And I think we should be, when these dead trees are gone, the little foresters who have come in and built up a logging plant, they will be eliminated under the present plan. And I guess I'd like to figure out a way of bringing back the logging industry. In the 70s, it was the third largest industry in the state, and it's been eliminated, and the forests are trashed because of it. So
if I may,
good.
The Black Hills, when you go around there, they're a very diverse forest, right? So you've got ponderosa pine, lodgepole, spruce fir, all within close proximity. There's a lot of different ages to that, a lot of which is because it's private, it's been under continuous management. That diversity of the forest is one of the things that makes it really resilient to bark beetles. And we know that. So if we go into any of the national forests in the state, the more diverse the forest in terms of species and age classes, the less mortality there is in that forest. It just so happens that in a lot of the national forests, you get these giant tracts of lodgepole pine that are all the same age, they're similar size. The bark beetles, that's where they thrive. Same with the spruce. And you can see that in Yellowstone also. So there's a place that's, nothing, you can't do anything in there, right? No forest management whatsoever. The places that are more age diverse and that have more species mixes, they have much less bark beetle mortality. And when you look at a map of that diversity and its relationship to mortality, the Black Hills stand out because it's a diverse area. The diversity of the Black Hills is due to a different reason, primarily the way that the substrates are. You got a lot of change in soils and short distances. There's been a lot of management there. That's different than the reasons for the diversity, say, in Yellowstone.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman,
Senator
just to clarify that a little bit. So what basically you're saying is that I think in relation to Representative Eklund's question, I guess, and your answer was that it doesn't appear that what you're saying is that regardless of what forest management is taking effect, it's not going to make any difference as far as the beetle problem goes. Now, that's what it sounds like to me, that you can do whatever you can for management, but it's not going to make any difference because of the nature of the beach. So is that what I get out of your answer?
No, I'm sorry if that was the impression I gave.
Okay, maybe it was just me.
If you use forest management to make a more diverse forest a century from now, it'll be more resilient to bark beetles. Okay. But if you use forest management to make a very uniform forest, it will not be resilient to bark beetles.
All right. I'm glad you clarified that because I was kind of heading down the wrong path there.
Yeah.
More questions for Dr. Ewers?
Just one more part of that too. And from the little bit that I remember working for the Forest Service many years ago as a college student, we used to talk about transition series and climax series of trees. So when you take out a section, whether it's beetles or logging or whatever, if you don't go in and replant that with the same species, you're going to end up with another transition series of trees in there. Is that right? And does that have an effect, I guess the question on the beetle problem when you do that?
So it depends on the forest that we're in. So if we're in lodgepole pine forest in the middle of its elevation, if you do a clear cut, right, and you do nothing and you leave a bunch of cones on the ground, you're going to get a bunch of lodgepole pine back. And you won't really go through any other series stage. If we're a little bit lower elevation and it's got a mix of ponderosa, aspen, lodgepole, you cut it, you're gonna get a bunch of aspen to start out with. And then you're gonna get some probably ponderosa, and you might get some lodgepole later. If we're up really high, we're in spruce fir. Right. Spruce fir often is uneven aged, right? So you got some old trees, you got little trees all growing together because they're fairly shade tolerant. Now, depending if you do a clear cut there, often it takes a long time to get things started if you don't replant. It doesn't come back as well as lodgepole unless you leave those young trees behind. The answer is it depends. So when we project into the future, if you end up with a less diverse, very uniform type of forest, that's what gets the bark beetle epidemic rolling. Because you get a whole bunch of trees in which they can get really great broods. And so you just get a few, let's say you have 10 trees that got stressed, hit by lightning, a small fire, the beetles go in and hit those. If they get their brood levels up, now they're going to be able to go to the adjacent healthy trees. And once they get in the healthy trees, they can really start getting lots and lots of young, and then that's when the epidemic gets rolling.
Okay, thank you. Representative Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the information that you shared with us would support the idea that the logging industry managed correctly to produce a diverse forest would be beneficial in preventing the pine beetle, because the loggers have really been beat up over the years for destroying forest, and it just sounds to me like that's way off base.
So it won't do much now. In most cases, It's too late, right? The beetles have gone through, the epidemic is done because they ran out of hosts. But if you're projecting yourself a century from now, when you want to get back to another mature forest, the more diverse that forest is, probably, and forest management is certainly a way to do that, the better off you will be.
Thank you.
Questions? Thank you, Dr. Yours. All right. Next thing is financial status report. Harry.
Mr. Chairman, come on up, Andy. Every year at the close of the fiscal period, so June 30, Andy closes the books on for the Water Development Commission, the agency. And then Andy puts forward a financial projection for anticipated revenues going forward, so that when we get to this meeting and then your December meeting, you have a good understanding of the revenue that's available in each of the 3 water development accounts. And that projection is first presented to you in August, and so at your August meeting, I walked you through those. But this year is a little unusual in that, and if you recall last year, go back, when we were at this meeting, we were talking about, we had made projections for the upcoming biennium. We're now into year 1 of the biennium. But last year we were talking about, and I'll use account 1 for an example, that projecting through that biennium that you would have available $69+ million in account 1. And that has to go through 2 fiscal years. So we looked at dividing that in 2, and last year, so the target was about $35 million in projects. And in fact, what was brought forward in your water plan or water program and ultimately approved by the legislature was a little over $35 million in projects. In account 2, so let me finish the story there. Then, so the anticipation would be that in the second year of the biennium, you would have about $35 million available for projects. And those are projects that would be considered in the 2017 legislative session that would then start, those projects will start in the second year of the biennium. In account 2, the last year's projection was about $11.3 million. You divide that by 2. The target was looking at about $5.5 million in funding, and in fact, you funded $5.8 million. if you look at now and I'm in tab A, I'm sorry, the financial projections. If you look at the financial projection that we're bringing forward now to you for the second year of the biennium, you see that bottom line is almost $54 million. It's not the 35 that you would have expected from last year. And so I asked Andy to come to this meeting so that you can fully understand what changes have happened that weren't necessarily anticipated last year. And then, of course, then going forward, those are the dollars that you have available for projects for the 2017 session. So with that, I'll let Andy kind of walk you through a more detailed analysis so you understand why there is a difference this year as opposed to what was projected a year ago.
If you start with, first of all, Mr. Chair and Select Water, thanks for having me today. If you start with the top on that account 1 projection, that's our cash balance in account 1, just under 105 million. And then the next part of it walks you through what happened in fiscal year 2016 in terms of revenue and expenditures. Our revenue, our mineral severance taxes hit that cap that we have. The next line is our investment interest income, followed by our principal and interest from any outstanding loans we may have from projects. The final half of the $3 million that was directed from the general fund to Water Development Account 1 in Session Law 2014. And then other is our category for our application fees or any water sales that we have from projects that we've done in the past. Which brings you to our total revenues of just over 30 million. The expenditures that happened during fiscal year 13, just under 25 million to give you our ending cash balance for fiscal year 2016. The next section takes a snapshot in time of our active appropriations as of July 1st. What projects do we have that we've committed funds to? Out of those, how much of the expenditures have been paid to say, okay, right now, this is what our uncommitted balance is if all of those expenditures were to occur at that time, which isn't really a possibility, but to give you an idea of what's been committed at that time. And then we add in 2 years of revenue for fiscal year 17 and 18, and you can see that Buffalo Bill dam account transfer, that was one of the big increases to account 1, which you approved in your May meeting, and that transfer occurred in August this year. And then we have our taxes, interest, and other for both of those fiscal year 17, 18 to get you down to the very bottom figure of your balance available for appropriation, which is almost 54 million.
Questions on that?
Chairman, and I think this was a question that I got here either our October meeting or August meeting. We're now looking at this projection for the second year of the biennium. So this 54 million, or just short of 54 million, is available to you in the next, for this group of projects that you're going to consider over the next 2 days. When we get to next August or next November, then you will see a projection that will be looking at not the current biennium, but the future biennium. So it will then be bringing in 2 years worth of revenue projections. And that's the one then that you will have to be looking at dividing in two and looking at it, spreading that out over 2 legislative sessions. So and I know this all kind of gets confusing a little bit, but I want to make sure everybody was of understanding as we go forward through all of the projects tomorrow. And if you've looked at your notebooks, we're recommending for account 1, $30 million worth of projects for this coming legislative session, so for the next 2 days. So you're well within the available funds that you have, but I will tell you one observation that with regards to this year's group of projects versus maybe the last 2 is we did not have a lot of the very large construction projects. I said last year we'd appropriated about 35 million. As I recall, I think you had upwards of $50 million in requests last year. So there's every year it's dynamic, it's different. This year we just did not seem to have a lot of the very large construction projects. And talk about account 2 as well.
Chairman, question for Harry.
Chairman?
Senator.
Thank you. Harry, can you go a little more in depth on Buffalo Bill Dam account transfer? And
Good question.
where it is, where it came from, and do we got statutory authority to transfer the money into it?
He explained it. It makes sense, but I can't remember it. Yes.
You want that? You want me to?
Sure, whatever. Senator, Mr. Chairman, that was done, came out of a recommendation from our Management Audit Committee that we take a look at our dam and reservoir accounts. In there in statute, I believe it's 99-1001. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's correct. And those accounts were set up to manage our water investment resources, Buffalo Bill being one of them. And that account is very healthy because we loaned money to the federal government for that modification, and they're still in the process of paying that back. And in reviewing, the commission reviewed each of those accounts to determine if there was excess funds in those accounts per statute in that 99-99-1001. If excess funds are to be found, they're to be transferred to account 1.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if
Go
I
ahead,
could
Harry.
add to that, that was a finding in the Management Audit Committee report that the commission, as required in the statute, should routinely review those accounts. And then if there are excess funds, then it directs the Water Development Commission to move those to Water Development Account 1. And I'll make the distinction, that is not spending those funds. That is merely moving those funds to account 1. And then for the next 2 days, we will be considering projects that will utilize dollars out of account 1. And then ultimately that's translated into the omnibus water bills, which then the full legislature gets to review and approve. So it's not spending authority, it's moving those dollars from that account. And those dollars originated in Water Development Account 1. That's at least my way of thinking is that's why the statutes then say if they're determined to be excess, you move them back to the source of origin for those dollars.
Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Harry, wasn't that a budget amendment last year? They took money from that account, Buffalo Bill Dam account, put in another one? Or am I thinking wrong on that?
So Mr. Chairman, Representative, what you're thinking about, I believe, is from 2 years ago, where I was directed by the governor to make a supplemental budget request for account $2, and my request was seeking general fund dollars, and it got caught. The request was made when revenues were pretty strong. Oil was $100 a barrel, and then by the time we got to the legislative session, oil had dropped to $50 a barrel. Revenues were on decline. And the legislature, and I recall working with Joint Appropriations Committee members, decided that in lieu of those dollars coming from the general fund, that they would be taken from the Buffalo Bill account number 2, or Buffalo Bill account, and transferred to account 2. And the reason for that request was that we knew clear back in June that we had several large construction projects. In fact, the original request totaled over, I believe, $18 million in projects. As it turned out, only $9 million of those projects were approved by the commission. And that's how the legislature then chose to fund what would be a large overage to account 2. But that was 2 years ago when the dollars came out of that account.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Canfield.
I had a question here. On the fiscal year 16 revenues, there's a loans and interest revenue of $6.8 million. That's not a reoccurring revenue on those loans and interest, or it doesn't show up on 17 anticipated and 18 anticipated. Don't anticipate any revenues from loans and interest.
Commissioner, Mr. Chairman, that loans and interest is higher this fiscal year 16 because we had a couple of loan payoffs. Yes, we do still receive loans principal from principal and interest from loans each year. It's included in that other category down below instead of a separate line item.
Questions? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just to cover the other two funds, just quickly walk through those again, because again, that's the number that, it's actually on my spreadsheet of projects, but those are the dollars that you will have available for consideration of new projects.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Bud Fallon.
Do you, and because all of the other branches of the Wyoming government are falling short under the budget shortfall this year, would you anticipate that if we don't spend all of the money in the water development counts, we get rated by somebody else? Or do you think that we're going to be okay in that regard?
Chairman,
Maybe I should ask that of Select Water.
I would suggest the legislators in the room would be a better source to answer that question.
I'm not, Mr. Chairman, I'm not totally sure on this, but I don't think we can, I'm not sure. I have to check on this, but I think these funds are pretty well set up. I don't know that we can even take these dollars or raid these dollars. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think if anything, the governor could be the one that would be moving them around rather than the legislature. But that's just my take on it. I'd have to check on that, Karen. I'm not sure.
Senator Driscoll.
Waterfront 3 has been what they've traditionally rated, but they should have rated. But the 3's been traditionally what they've gone after, and they've repaid it. I'm not sure if there's been times, Harry probably knows, but generally they've given it back in better times, but they've sure done it. There's precedent there.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could, in account 1, and Andy pointed this out, under 16 revenues, there's a general fund appropriation of 1.5 million. That represents half of what was taken back in the 2000s to help balance the budget. It was a $3 million diversion from account 1, and the legislature remembered that and said, we need to repay that. And so that's the second of two $1.5 million payments. And then if you go to account 3, if I'm correct, you see a general, this is under 2016 revenues, a general fund payment of $9.3 million. That was it? It was not half.
It was supposed to be the original repayment was supposed to be $38,665,000, and that was repaying funds that were diverted from account 3 for the Gillette Madison pipeline project, as well as in that same year that the $3 million was taken from account 1, they took $22,250,000 from account 3.
But they will. Yeah, they will now.
And then just to finish, Mr. Chairman, finish the story, the balance then, last year about this time then, there was $10 million diverted from water development account 3. It came from that payment. So that would have ordinarily been a $19 million payment. It's the second one of those payments. So 19 times 2 is you get to your 38 million that had been borrowed previously. But again, there was another $10 million diversion last year to balance fiscal year 16, as I recall. And that was initiated by the governor's office, confirmed by the legislature.
Questions?
I just, again, I don't see, this year and we'll find this out in the next 2 days, or you will, that the volume of projects is down a little bit. That we don't have the bigger construction projects, certainly in account 1. We're going to bring to you some construction projects in account 3. But I think it's important then that you keep focused on those dollars that are available, and certainly my recommendations are well within what is available to you. Account 2 is a little bit skinny. And then certainly, and I think this goes to Senator Driscoll's question or comments, that when the legislature set these three funds up, they were intended to be self-sufficient. We have severance tax dollars that flow into those. Any loans that are made out of those accounts, the principal and interest payments come back. Likewise, on the reservoir O&M accounts, those dollars come from water development. And if at a certain point in time you deem them to be excess, or the dollars in there are in excess of what the O&M needs are, then those dollars come back to water development account one. And that's the way those three accounts operate. And we don't typically go for a general fund request. And likewise, I would hope then that the legislature would keep those funds intact so that we can continue to fund water development projects.
Questions or comments? Okay. Guess that's it.
Okay.
On that,
Mr.
if you're,
Chairman,
if you're done, we're done with that.
Okay. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Mr. Chairman, if we could go to account 3, so tab A, the third sheet, which is your financial on account 3.
It's the same format as before, so I'll just quickly, there is one difference that you did not see in August. If you look under that outstanding commitments heading, there is a separate listing there for the West Fork Reservoir reversion. That was not included in your August projection as we had a current contract. These funds, $7 million was appropriated that unencumbered funds would reverted on July 1st of 2016. And that unencumbered amount is just over $6 million. And that $6 million is going to be asked for as a reappropriation, if you will, in this year's round of projects because the work is not done yet. It's a proper term.
Yeah, so tomorrow afternoon in account 3, you're going to see me ask that you reappropriate that's the balance of the 7 million. So it's 7 million less the 800,000 that's under contract. So the 6.2, you're going to see me asking that you reappropriate those dollars. And it's simply because that appropriation expired after a 3-year time frame. But that is new to that account. And so again, on the West Fork project, 6.2 reverted, I'm going to ask you to reappropriate that. So in my mind, that is a no net change, but certainly in the legislative process, it will show up as a new appropriation. But those dollars came back into account 3.
Barry, is the funding applications going to take a while, or can you get through them pretty quick, or?
I think there may be some discussion for a while, so.
Okay, we might take a break then
Okay.
before you get into those. Let's take a 10-minute break.
Just took a 10-minute break.
You're welcome. Thought we were on our last.
You could see that.
You got a hot date tonight, Stan, or what?
Yes, I do.
Buff color, satin, more that color. Try those almond.
All right, Harry, we'll go ahead and go on to funding applications.
Every time I'm traveling and stuff to get something, I always look all over the place. But there's always
Projects that you will be considering in the next 2 days that may have some kind of controversy about, be something special about them. And it's not my intent to try to influence you or bias you one way or the other on those, but there are some projects that, again, for various reasons, may have a little different twist to them. So if you go to tab B in your skinny notebook, you have a 3-page spreadsheet, and each of those pages represent water development account 1 or 2 or 3. And there's a number of projects that I just want to go down and talk to you about those. And so the first project is the item number 6, tab F, Lake DeSmet purchase of storage. And just to give you a little more information, we being myself, I suppose, Water Development Office, have been approached by representatives of Sasol Synfuels about their water asset ownership in and around Lake DeSmet. And they currently hold what I would call the remnants of the energy coal development project that really started back in the 50s. And if you might this evening take a look at the write-up under tab F, because we've tried to lay out some history. This started back, I think, 1954 with Reynolds Mining. They sold their interest to Texaco, which then became Chevron. And ultimately then in the 2000s, the water asset, so that energy company effort built Lake DeSmet as you see it today. So that's an impoundment, 230 some thousand acre feet. They built a diversion structure on Clear Creek, a rather impressive structure, and there's some pictures of that in your recommendation. That diverts water out of Clear Creek into another 5,000 acre foot impoundment called Lake Healy. And then Lake Healy is, that water is pumped from Lake Healy through a rather enormous pump station with 6 1,500 horsepower electric motors in there. And that's intended to pump water from Lake Healy over a short divide to Lake DeSmet. And that's how water was to be moved to Lake DeSmet. And the transmission line is 6.7 miles of 66-inch diameter pipeline. So this was a rather large project and plan. But for various reasons, the coal never developed, the coal to liquids process never developed. And so these assets have now been split. Johnson County owns Lake DeSmet, and they own all of the water right permits in DeSmet except for 3 permits that total about 62,000 acre feet, and those are held by Sasol. Sasol owns the Clear Creek diversion, Lake Healy or Healy Reservoir, the pump station, and the transmission line. And so all of those Sasol assets went on the market for sale along with their ranch holding. They have a 10,000 acre ranch that overlies some rather shallow and extensive coal deposits. So that was the energy source for the coal to fuels or the industrial program that was planned for the last really 60 plus years. So Sasol has declared they're going to divest themselves of those assets. That ranch and water assets went on the market last February. The current price for all of that is about $18.9 million. And what we're now talking about, and I've talked to some, I guess I'll say at least one potential buyer of the ranch, that if you're looking at this from a ranching perspective, Okay, the ranch has a value. The ranch has its own set of direct flow water rights. It doesn't rely on Lake DeSmet water rights. So there's really no, from a ranching perspective, there's no value in these Lake DeSmet water assets from the ranching perspective. So this one landowner, at least that I spoke to, or prospective buyer, I'll say, they're interested in the ranch, but they don't want anything to do with a Clear Creek diversion, Lake Healy pump station, transmission line, Lake DeSmet. So the thought is, in talking with representatives of Sasol, that Sasol may be interested in splitting off the water asset package and selling that separate from the ranch. And I think there may be some synergy in that. So the proposal that I am bringing forward to you is to appropriate $4.5 million with the intent then that the Water Development Office, and certainly if there's, if you want to designate a commission member to participate in this, but negotiate then with Sasol a purchase agreement for those water assets. And ultimately, if an agreement is reached, then that agreement comes back to the commission for approval and for the Select Water Committee for approval. But the dollars would be appropriated for that particular purpose. And in looking at the value, and Jason Mead and myself and Dale Anderson out of the office, and we also used a consultant to go up there and look at those facilities here about a month ago. The state of Wyoming has invested in water assets over the years, and Palisades Reservoir, Fontenelle Reservoir, Buffalo Bill Reservoir, Pathfinder, Glendo are all part of that package, along with High Savory. And I think DeSmet, specifically that 62,000 acre feet of space, it really fits into that same category. And then if you look at the price of what we're proposing for funding some of these new reservoirs, I'm talking like $40 million type numbers for 5,000 or 6,000 or 8,000 acre feet of new reservoir. When you look at a 5,000 acre foot reservoir and 62,000 acre feet of space, it would seem that in terms of the value, this might be a bargain. Now, there are problems with that, and that whole recommendation, we've tried to tell you what the downside of this might be. There's O&M costs. So if this purchase was ultimately purchased by the state, then we would want to set up a reservoir O&M account so that we have the O&M dollars to pay for that. The reservoir is rather low in the drainage, so in terms of being used by higher water users, it's not necessarily good for that. The Lake DeSmet Dam, the North Dam, when the reservoir is completely full, it has some leakage problems through, I believe it's the right abutment, so they don't fill the reservoir entirely, so that derates that 62,000 acre feet of space down to about 50,000 acre feet. But nevertheless, so there's pros and cons, benefits and a downside for that, and I think I want you to understand that. And so I think that's kind of just a short synopsis. If you have questions today, I'd be happy to address those, or I'll bring Jason up here as well. Some of the benefits that I see, one, we have now an interstate scenario where Montana can place calls on the Tongue River. They have done that for the last 2 years. Lake DeSmet sits about 5 miles from the Tongue River drainage. So if the infrastructure was built to move water from DeSmet, pump water from DeSmet into the Tongue River drainage, then that water could be used as replacement water so that Wyoming irrigators could continue to irrigate in the event of a call from Montana. I think even though the Powder River was ultimately dropped from that litigation, I think now that there is an interstate ability to make a call, that you could see that on the Powder. And so Lake DeSmet sits in the Powder River Basin, or the Powder River drainage. So you have that same ability there. Obviously, then there's irrigation water that comes out of the DeSmet reservoir that could be available for lease for downstream irrigators. So it's a pretty complicated package. My recommendation to you is that I would like to explore possibly purchasing that asset, but ultimately that would be your decision if we want to move forward with that, and then certainly Select Water and the full legislature and the governor as well. So I guess questions on my rambling description of a kind of an interesting project.
Senator Cooper? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Harry, I was wondering about if the state does acquire those assets, what about the maintenance thing? And maybe you covered it and I wasn't in here when you talked about, what about the overall, maintenance of the facility and stuff like that? Would that be then the Water Development Commission doing that, or how would that?
Mr. Chairman, in our recommendation, we're estimating that those annual O&M costs, Healy, pump station, and there's some water delivery obligations that come out of Healy and Lake DeSmet, are on the order of $75,000 to $125,000 per year. And that would be a responsibility of the state of Wyoming.
And Mr. Chairman, just follow up on that. And then, okay, so this would be something in the order of what we have, like, for example, at High Savory now. I mean, that would be the same type of operation. I mean, you would maintain it similar. It's not, I realize it's a different kind of facility, but something along that order?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Senator, it would be similar to that. It's actually a hybrid because there would be a wholly owned reservoir, Healy Reservoir, 5,000 acre feet. There's also then an ownership interest in water rights in a reservoir that's owned now by Johnson County. So that would be similar to our interest in Fontenelle Reservoir, Palisades, Pathfinder, Buffalo Bill, those federal reservoirs where we pay our proportionate share of operations and maintenance every year. And that's what those reservoir O&M accounts are set up to, so that we have funding to do that.
Mr. Chairman, just one more follow-up on it. So there is, and I'm sorry it's taking me a while to get through this thing, but there is a return on investment here somehow or another. There's a kind of I don't want to know if I want to call it debt service program on the 4.5, but I mean, there's some way there is revenue generated from this is that what you were saying earlier? I didn't quite follow that.
Mr. Chairman, we've not identified a revenue stream currently. There's one of the other potential benefits would be to transfer a portion of the water rights out of Lake DeSmet up to a future Bull Creek Reservoir, which is being contemplated. And that gives them a better priority water right. And it reduces then either the size of the reservoir and the cost of that reservoir, or it improves the yield of that reservoir. So there's a benefit. But in terms of right now, is there a positive revenue stream going from these assets to Sasol? My answer is no, not currently. But there is that potential.
Senator Driscoll.
Chairman, thanks, Harry. I guess I've got a whole series of questions I'll kind of ask and let you string through them. Probably first one is, why are we allocating 4.5 million up front when it's going to have to go through the legislature anyway? Are we not just telling them, hey, we've got 4.5 million? Is that what they're asking? Because to me, if we're negotiating, I'd rather send a team negotiate and come back with a price back to the commission and say, here's the price, do you want to pay it or not, rather than put in the paper what we're paying for it and then try to negotiate backwards. Second, I see in here the water rights are adjudicated, but they're subject to abandonment. Are we not going to follow our own rules as far as keeping our water rights up? I think that's a pretty key issue. And then last, I see there's a pretty good chance Johnson County is probably going to want to turn us back. They're part of the reservoir. I'd like to know how much money they've got invested, because it might be 4.5 million is the tip of the iceberg as we buy a reservoir that we have to maintain and keep up and don't have sales for the water that they can't sell. So I guess I've got some pretty good questions. I'm not opposed to negotiating, but I really hate it when the government shows up with a checkbook with it. It's already wrote out before we start.
So, Mr. Chairman, let me handle the abandonment issue first. When these water rights were permitted, and some of them were moved to this reservoir, have they're pre-1950 water rights, and then there's a couple of post-50, they're 1950s, 58, I think. That's in that write-up. The reservoir was built. The water has been stored. Those water rights have been adjudicated. But that water, and they're permitted primarily for industrial and irrigation use. The industrial use has never shown up. Reynolds Mining, Texaco, Chevron, Sasol were never able to develop that industrial use of water. So that has led to the supposition that if it's never been used for that, then they are subject to abandonment. And that led to a special statute, which is cited in the write-up, that requires that an annual report be filed with the Board of Control every year, and that once every 5 years, a report be filed with the Board of Control showing the due diligence efforts to utilize those water rights. And by virtue of that statute, then if the Board of Control grants, in essence, the petition, then that avoids the abandonment or protects those water rights from abandonment. And that has religiously been done by the owners of these water rights since they were moved to this reservoir. So that's an ongoing effort that has to happen as part of these water rights. With regards to the $4.5 million, that's an interesting, I guess. So my conversations with a representative of Sasol, it's been suggested that $5 million would buy these water assets. If you look at what we're paying for other reservoirs, building them new, it's still a bargain by any means. I'm not willing to go to the $5 million. I suggested $4.5, but I think what we have to be able to show to this seller is that we're a serious buyer. And my thoughts to you are that if the money is appropriated in this amount, then yes, in fact, we are serious. If we go forward and negotiate a deal without any money behind the deal, and then I bring it to the legislature and the Water Development Commission first, and they said, well, we're just really not interested, I don't know that I will be able to get to a serious negotiating point without demonstrating that I am in fact a serious buyer. And that's what $4.5 million does. Hence that approach. But I share your concern, Senator, in that I'm waiving my highest and best offer, and I got to tell you, I don't think it's my highest and best offer, because a pump station that doesn't necessarily have a practical use, or these, and we can get into the details of 1,500 horsepower motors and what it costs when you turn them on. DeSmit can be filled from another source of water rights out of a different drainage, and that's where it's being filled. But this pump station is not operated for, was it 15 plus years, Jason? Or maybe even longer than that. I consider the pump station potentially a liability. And so that's all part of this negotiation. I don't want to negotiate in public, but I'm thinking that the initial offer from the state of Wyoming would be much less than $4.5 million. But again, I've got an appropriation that backs that up.
Commissioner Canfield.
Mr. Chairman, you said that the Healy Reservoir has an issue with an right embankment leaking, which could be a liability. I got about 3 questions here. How serious could that be in the future? What could that do to us? And then where does our water lay in DeSmit? Because DeSmit also has an issue with filling over a certain line. And at what level is our water lay there? And then the other part I think you answered was, if we do we have to transfer water through here to DeSmit? Or is that pump station a critical part of this whole thing? And how much obligation are we taking on? How much liability? I guess there's three parts to that.
So, Mr. Chairman, your first two questions really involve Lake DeSmet. Healy Reservoir is in good shape. It is the right abutment for Lake DeSmet that leaks when that reservoir is filled to the very top. And so even though that reservoir is permitted to 234,000 acre feet, they generally do not fill it over, is it 190 or 200,000 acre feet, Jason?
Right in there, it's about.
So what the owner of the reservoir, Johnson County, is doing is that they're managing that facility to avoid that seepage through the right abutment by not filling it totally. And what that does is it derates all of the water rates or water rights in that reservoir. So when I say they've got 62,000 acre feet of permits that Sasol holds, when you don't fill it to the top, those are derated to somewhere on the order of about 50,000 acre feet. But that water is in the reservoir now, and the reservoir is holding water. Now, in the future, if you suddenly wanted to fill to 234,000, we're talking about an extensive geotechnical effort. And part of this work was done previously where they grouted that right abutment and they solved part of the problem, but they didn't solve the upper part of that problem. And if that's the case, then you're going to see, I think, a request from Johnson County for a Water Development Commission project to assist in funding of that kind of a dam rehabilitation project. But I think for the moment, that reservoir is operating quite satisfactorily at about the 200,000 acre foot level.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Then you don't see us taking on the potential of a huge liability by buying into this.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if you buy any dam or reservoir like High Savory, it is definitely a liability and it's a safety of dams issue that you have to be cognizant of. Currently, the way the rights are structured, though, Sasol is not the owner of this dam. They are not the owner of the reservoir. They are not the owner of the underlying lands. They hold a permit or three permits in the reservoir. So you have to recognize that if there is an O&M issue, you're going to pay your proportionate share. And that is exactly the scenario that we use at Fontenelle Reservoir or Pathfinder Reservoir. We pay our proportionate share of O&M costs at those facilities. So if there is an extraordinary issue at one of those facilities, then the way those contracts are structured is that Wyoming, by virtue of owning contracts for space in those reservoirs, pays a proportionate share of those costs. That's a reality of owning a dam and reservoir. In this case, we would not be the listed owner, but believe me, there's about a 30% share by virtue of our water right permits that we would share. And then your last question, Commissioner, was that recently in the last, and I don't know the dates on these permits. So the original concept was you divert water out of Clear Creek, bring it into Healy, you pump it over the divide into the, what's the drainage? I want to say Shell, but that's not right. No. They're filling DeSmet out of Piney Creek. So you divert it into the Piney Creek drainage to fill DeSmet. That was the original concept. There has since been several filings out of Piney Creek to bring supplemental water into DeSmet, and so it can be filled by gravity out of Piney Creek. But those permits have a more junior water right. So right now you can fill these rights by gravity. But if you ever got into a situation, and this is how the planning for the industrial complex was made, that where they were planning on using a lot more water, then they needed to bring Clear Creek water into this reservoir. That required this pump station. But I would not anticipate that we would want to operate that pump station unless we had a large industrial user that suddenly wanted to contract for that water in DeSmet.
Mr. Chairman?
Commissioner Bud Fallon.
So who is the underlying, who would end up owning the underlying land and the dam? If we're just,
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, the current owner is Johnson.
right, so then, I think this potential O&M issue, and, I mean, it looks to me like we're spending $4 million, A, to make sure the legislature doesn't rob our budget, and B, I think there's a lot of liability out there that we don't know about. And so if something happens to the dam or there's a safety of dams issue, are you telling me that Johnson County then would be responsible for fixing that? Or are they going to look at us and say, you're the ones that've got to deal with it?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, the way that would work is Johnson County is responsible. They would be required to make the repairs to make it safe. And then they will send us a bill, or they will send the Sasol water right owners a bill, a proportionate share of that O&M cost.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
And we don't have any, you haven't been contacted by anybody. There's nobody right now that owns those water rights. So we don't even know what we do with the water rights. I mean, I'm all for taking care of water rights, but I'm not very excited about this project unless somebody can convince me this is a great idea, except for we just want to make sure we spend every dime we can so nobody else gets it. Because that's what it looks like to me.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Evans.
My consideration on this cuts both ways. On the one hand, if you've got this a great deal of water, 62,000 acre feet available, doesn't seem that there's an immediate purchaser for it. Doesn't seem there's somebody who really wants to step up and use it, and you can buy it at a great price. That's very tempting. But the flip side is that nobody seems to want this water. Nobody seems to want to step up or has an idea of how to use that water. You can speculate helping to assist the Tongue River irrigators if there's a call or otherwise using it. But my concern, I mean, it sounds like a bargain and a chance to buy acre feet of water, but you know, it's going to be used by somebody someday, but there's nobody stepping up right now. So I would be afraid we'd be kind of stuck with this for a long time without an apparent desire on anybody's part to utilize that water.
So Mr. Chairman, let me clarify. My reason for bringing this to you is not to tie up funds or spend dollars so it will be stolen. That is not the case. I believe that this represents a potential to buy a water asset, a large chunk of water, that in this particular part of the state is not state-owned at this point in time, and that is consistent with reservoir purchases that the state of Wyoming has made for the last 40 or 50 years. And I'll start with Fontenelle Reservoir. We have acquired contracts starting in the 1960s for 120,000 acre feet of space. We have contracts for that water that total about 46,000 acre feet. We have never delivered a drop of that water since the reservoir was built. But it is a water asset that Wyoming felt was an investment that should be made for the future of Wyoming. And so I can't show you today on this asset how it will pay or how it will cost or cash flow, because I don't have buyers for that water. But most definitely we have made that investment. In Buffalo Bill Reservoir, we invested $25 million for 190,000 acre feet of water space. And we have yet to contract for a drop of that water. And we've owned that water for 25 years plus. I will make the argument also that on the Pathfinder modification project, where we spent $6.5 million in round numbers, we enlarged the reservoir. We obtained out of that a 34,000 acre foot account that we pledged for endangered species recovery in the Central Platte, and another 20,000 acre foot account for water that could be used for municipalities in the Platte in the event they are regulated off by the North Platte decree with Nebraska, so that we have basically stepped in and shored up Wyoming water uses when interstate compacts or decrees would declare that we cannot use that water. And I think that's why I point out the Montana v. Wyoming is that it is in essence the same situation. And again, Wyoming has entered into, I'll go back to the Platte and Pathfinder, the 3-state agreement for endangered species recovery. It allows us to continue to develop water under programmatic coverage, but Wyoming has stepped up to pay for that particular use of water and said, we're going to use storage water to do that. And I think that same potential exists for DeSmet from IE and interstate call from Montana. That's a potential benefit. But will it cash flow next year? No. But I think for the future, those are the kinds of investments that the commission and the state have made, and I think it falls under that category. That's why I'm bringing it to your attention. And certainly, you are the decision makers and the legislature and the governor. And if we don't take that forward, that's great. But it's, when I look at building a 6,000 acre foot or so reservoir for $40 million, and we got to deal with NEPA, and here's an asset, 60,000, another 5,000 acre foot that we can buy, and no NEPA, then I think there's some advantages, benefits that we may want to take a serious look at, and that's why I'm bringing it to you.
Mr. Chairman.
Karen, go ahead.
So have you talked to Johnson County or the other special districts in this area to see what their opinion is of this?
To the question with regards to Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Fallon, I have talked with Johnson County commissioners. They obviously would rather have the state as the partner than Sasol, a private company. We're a little bit more reliable to deal with, I think, when it comes to operation and maintenance. So they're in favor of it. There hasn't been extensive discussion with them, but the main reason I wanted to come up here was to really talk about what I see. And I'm not a proponent or an opponent of this. I just want to provide information to everybody for consideration. The potential benefits to the Bull Creek site. That's the reservoir that we went and toured back in 2015, I believe. I think that's right. That's south of Buffalo, about 5 miles. We're looking at a 14,500 acre foot reservoir there. It gets water out of Clear Creek, which is the same source for the 62,199 acre feet that Sasol owns. Now, currently there's not a demand for this water, the industrial water that Sasol owns, and the reservoir or that storage right is filled out of Piney Creek. But that's hanging over the Bull Creek reservoir project. So if they were to develop that sometime in the future, Sasol or the buyer, then it reduces the 8 out of 10 year yield of the Bull Creek site because it's the same source of water, and it would be a senior right compared to the present day water right for a Bull Creek reservoir. So just as an example, or these are the actual numbers that our consultants have come up with. We're planning for a 14,500 acre foot reservoir at Bull Creek. With that industrial demand turned on, the yield 8 out of 10 years would be about 5,200 acre feet. With that yield gone, or I'm sorry, yield, with that demand, that industrial demand taken away from Sasol, that would go up by about 3,700 acre feet. So it would go from 5,200 firm yield to 8,900 acre feet of firm yield. And if you look at that difference, the present value of that difference over 50 year and what that could could do for crop yields and everything else, we're looking at about a $26 million benefit for that increase in yield of Bull Creek Reservoir. The other way to look at it is instead of having to build a 14,500 acre foot reservoir at Bull Creek, if you wanted to just say, okay, we're going to be happy with 5,200 acre feet of firm yield there, take Sasol and that industrial demand out of the picture, you can then build an 8,600 acre foot reservoir and get the same yield, which saves you about 10.5 million in that instance. So there's benefit to a potential project that we're looking at in Bull Creek. So I just want to provide that information just for food for thought.
Commissioner Easer. I remember when we toured both that site and this reservoir, and I still think it's a very good investment for the state. And it's just, I'm a big supporter of the state acquiring more stored water rights for the future on different drainages, because I think it's going to get hotter and drier, and the uses for that water are going to grow, not shrink, both in the diversity use and the demands and for different uses. So it's, in this case, you're buying, I think it's about $73 an acre foot. It's a really cheap buy. You can barely do the NEPA compliance on a lot of these sites for that amount. So we're getting a really good buy on it. Our partner is a county of the state of Wyoming, not the Bureau of Reclamation. That's simpler and that's a benefit. There's the synergy between this reservoir and the Bull Creek site. So that adds value. So, I agree you want to negotiate as hard as you can, but I think this is a very good investment that gives the state lots of opportunity in the future.
The other thing I would add was that, sorry, Mr. Commissioner or Mr. Chairman, that the three rights that we're talking about that make up that 62,199, two of them, as Harry mentioned, are 1957 rights, and one is a 1939 right, which is a pre-compact right. And not that we've had problems with Montana on the powder, but we have on the tongue. So if that in the future spills over into the powder, that would be a pre-compact right, wouldn't be affected by that litigation, I don't think. If it were to be, one idea would be to transfer that up to the Bull Creek site. There's some institutional complexities associated with that, but it's always a possibility too. So
Mr. Chairman, to add to that, by being a pre-compact right, what it means in the case of an interstate call is that the call only affects post-50 water rights. And so, and this is what has happened on the tongue in the last 2 years, is storage rights that are post have to be curtailed. Pre-50 rights are not curtailed under that interstate call. And so at least that portion of the water right could continue to fill in that scenario. And again, that's another opportunity that as those post-1950 storage water rights, those reservoirs can't fill those calls have come in the springtime, then here's a pool of water that we can offer to Montana and say, oh, well, we're going to allow our post-1950 storage rights to fill, and we're going to replace that water with this water that has been stored out of DeSmet. And in so doing there is an opportunity to lease that water, and that generates a cash flow, because I think in many cases those irrigators or municipalities, as the case may be, would much prefer to be able to pay for water and be able to store that water in their reservoirs for later on in the year. So it is a complicated scenario. There's no doubt about it. But again, my thoughts to you is this is an opportunity that is at least worth considering.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Evans.
Harry, what are you asking us to do today? Are you asking us to approve the $4.5 million, or just that would be for later?
So, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, today is just information, but tomorrow when this comes up, then will be asking you to recommend an appropriation of $4.5 million, which then Select Water will have to also pass judgment on, and then ultimately the full legislature.
Representative Eklund.
The Bull Creek Reservoir site as a possibility, isn't that the site that doesn't seal up, that it would require some kind of a vinyl bottom to make that reservoir work? That's part of the question. The second part of the question is, what was the intended use for the water that we would put in the Bull Creek Reservoir?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Eklund, we were looking at a lower Bull Creek site that did have some uncemented sandstone bedrock underneath it, which was leaky, as you mentioned. Since that time, we've looked at the geology and moved upstream and actually done some geotechnical drilling this spring under new ownership. That was that land exchange process. But that's much tighter Cody shale, and it looks like it's feasible upper site. Your second question in regards to the uses for the Bull Creek Reservoir, the majority of it is going to be for irrigation water, both in potentially the Clear Creek drainage, as well as we can gravity around to the French Creek drainage. There would be potential for municipal water for the city of Buffalo. We would also have a pool designated for essentially stream flow, in-stream flow almost through town, because there's a series of 6 or 7 ditches above Buffalo that tend to dewater the creek through town during irrigation season. And we can, again, gravity water back to Clear Creek and provide water through town for environmental benefits. And then we'd have a minimum pool for recreation and fisheries as well. So it's multi-use reservoir for sure. It's kind of, as I say, the poster child of reservoirs from the ones that we're looking at as far as multiple or a lot of potential there. So
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there is a use for this water that you're talking about purchasing at DeSmet, or is it too low? Do we have to pump it?
Well, there's
quite a ways to get it.
As far as the land area, the irrigated acres that we're trying to serve out of the Bull Creek site, Lake DeSmet is too low in the drainage to serve those. Lake DeSmet was just built in the wrong spot, basically, back in the day. It's too low. Senator Driscoll.
Following kind of down the same path, back to the Bull Creek. Is the reservoir cost of Bull Creek still $100 million or so?
It's right in that ballpark. Yeah.
And how are the irrigators paying for it? Where's the money going to come from on 8,000 irrigated acres?
It would be very similar to all the rest of the reservoirs we're looking at. And public benefit. So I'm assuming a large portion of that would come from the water development program, and then the other portion would come from the irrigators.
70, 80 million out of water program and maybe 15 million for irrigators.
Possibility. Haven't gotten that far down the road yet.
Putting on my cap, are we not further ahead, even if it's uphill, to fire up the pump station? Maybe we ought to buy the ranch and the water and throw Bull Creek over the
Some
bank
cattle on.
and pump water to them off interest costs forever. I'm just looking at real, you're looking at 14,000 acre feet at 114 million versus 60,000, which it's pretty obvious to me if you buy 60,000, you're going to get 200,000 because we've got a long history in DeSmet owners dating back 70 years that have never found out how to even pay the O&M out of it. So, we're going to be the proud owner of something that I get. I'm same as Bill. It's got a future value, but for right now, it's an albatross as far as what we're getting. Last, can we generate electricity out of DeSmet? I'm pretty blind and dumb on this, but is it set up to generate electricity, and does it have potential?
Mr. Chairman, currently is not set up to generate hydropower. That's been an idea tossed around in the past. I think Sasol's looked at that a little bit as far as pump storage. use that pump station or some kind of more modern pump station. These are fairly old pumps that we're talking about. Pump the water up into Lake DeSmet out of Healy Reservoir when the demand's low, energy demand, and then turn around and run it through Penstock on the way back down during high demand times of the day. So there is that potential. We haven't looked at it in depth to know exactly if it's feasible or not. That might be more of a future potential when the population up in that area continues to grow. So,
Chairman, two last, elevation difference from the city of Buffalo to DeSmet, roughly. I see that's only 10 miles apart. I mean, we drove by it.
Have that off the top of my head.
Okay. Feasible to pump water back to Buffalo, though.
It's feasible, but when we were looking at that, Wank Associates is the engineering firm that's been looking at the Bull Creek site and also the one that went out with us to the pump station. That's formerly States West Water Resources. And they looked at a lot of the work that was done in the past for the Buffalo municipal water supply. And Lake DeSmet was looked at along with all the other alternatives, including Tyhack. And it was more economical to build Tyhack than it was to try to pump water back up from Lake DeSmet.
Chairman, last question. It appears to me with all the complexities, water rights, and I so hate, as you guys know, our level 1 studies. They drive me insane how much money we spend engineering. But it appears to me that before anybody could do any honest negotiations on this, and it doesn't appear it's time sensitive on sale, I would suggest we go to another $100,000 study to figure out if it actually has anything or not. I'd like Harry to comment on that, because the complexity of this is just wild. And for somebody to sit down and in the dark estimate O&M costs and PCBs and water rights appears to me to be shaky at best.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, I think that's certainly one approach, and I guess I would say a prudent approach to get that full analysis. And so I think if that's the desire, we can certainly go down that road. I can tell you it's interesting because the ranch and package have been for sale for, well, now about 8 months. I don't know that there's an active or serious buyer for everything at this point in time. This opportunity, I believe, carries on with a new owner, in that if it is sold, they're going to buy it for the ranching benefits potentially. I don't believe they're going to be buying it for the coal benefits, at least in the near future. And so that might be a more prudent approach to take and fully flesh out some of these ideas. I think because States West has been familiar with this structure, that's why we asked them to tag along with us on the inspection. And I think, I believe the memo here captures very adequately what the liabilities are, but certainly it's not to the same degree as a full-blown engineering analysis would be. And so that may be a prudent approach.
More questions, comments on this?
Mr. Chairman,
Commissioner Canfield.
I have to agree with Senator Driscoll. There's a lot of questions in there about that. One of them would be, what happens if we don't do anything? Does somebody in the private sector, which is better than the government owning that, what is the value? If we go to playing around there, do we drive the value up? If there's not a critical need of some entity somewhere to use that water, I have to question what the value would be. And I guess it's a little confusing. It's a pretty complex question. Do we help this thing at all by playing around with throwing money into it?
Mr. Chairman,
Commissioner Bud Fallon.
as you also know, I am not a fan of level 1 study after study either, but I would actually support that. I think that there's too many financial, very funny, Bill. I think there's too many financial and economic questions that just haven't been answered. I don't think we have any idea what we're getting into. And I think if we studied it for a year and then came back with a recommendation and answers on what could be future O&M costs, what really are the possibilities of selling water, are we competing with private interests, all those kind of questions, I think then we could make a legitimate decision. And if the ranches, Sasol's been trying to get rid of this thing that long, I can't fathom that somebody's going to waltz in there and buy it out from under us. So I don't see this as a critical, you've got to purchase it right now kind of deal. So I actually like that idea.
Senator Meyer.
A couple of ideas. Anything preclude Montana from either filing an abandonment action on this right or the owners going
Did water rights attorney in the Montana v. Wyoming leave?
I texted Chris about this, and you have to get this to affect.
Could you repeat that? Could you ever speak up?
Could you repeat that?
Abby, could you come up to a mic and repeat that?
Chris was saying that they, with at least how it relates to the lawsuit, is they looked at this and you'd have to pipe the dismount water into the Tongue River. And at the present, there's no way of doing that. So I'm not sure.
The question I have,
You
to bring it up, Abby, is that I believe the director told us that part of this water all from ideas, but that's something that looking at it. People I think would probably buy it would be the state of Montana that might say this is a great deal. $72 an acre feet. It's a heck of a deal. But one way you could do it is, get an option at 50 cents an acre foot or something like that while the study is done, and then at least it's locked up. It wouldn't cost you much to at least to lock it up. So as far as spending money for appropriation, I might look at maybe getting an option that would apply to a future sales price or something, but that's about as far as I think I would go. You're being asked to spend $4.5 million for something that essentially could be abandoned the day after tomorrow. So what are you actually getting?
So, Mr. Chairman, Senator, with regards to abandonment and Montana bringing that action, and again, I am not the water rights expert, but you have to have standing to bring an abandonment. I don't believe Montana has standing in this state with regards to Wyoming water rights. So to me, that seems a little questionable, but your option of could Montana buy it? Absolutely. And then the benefit to Montana becomes releasing that water down the Powder River for its irrigators on their stretch of the Powder River.
More questions or comments on this? Okay. I guess we'll move on to whatever you got else.
Okay, Mr. Chairman,
I think
that's one out of about 50 projects, so. The next one I'd like to talk to you about is tab N in the big notebook, Lance Creek. I guess this is a project that's a little disappointing in my mind, but and it's a short write-up, but I don't know whether Lance Creek representatives will be here tomorrow, but we've had kind of a pretty extensive recent history with the district. Lands Creek Water and Sewer District, not very many taps. They had, back in 2008, an EPA administrative order. We brought forward a level 2 study where we drilled some groundwater exploration wells. We were looking for better quality water. Arsenic was the issue, as I recall. It took us 3 wells before we found a suitable source of water. The well is located on state land where the arsenic levels were down, where the community could use that. We then brought the project to you and Lance Creek had applied for construction dollars to tie that well, put a pump in the well, tie that well into their community water system. And the contract, the 2000 or the level 3 appropriation was 2013. So they received that agreement in 2013. And one of the provisions in our standard agreement is that if the community sells water outside of their jurisdiction, outside of their primary use, which their primary use is potable, then the first sets of payments, or the first payments, have to be applied to any outstanding loan for water development. And then once that loan is paid off, then a proportionate share of that revenue is returned to water development, and it's proportionate to the grant amount. So if the loan's paid off and they sold a tank of water to an oil and gas exploration company and they were paid, I'll just say $100, then 67% of that would have to be returned to water development, because we're in the business of helping water communities for their primary use, potable water in this case. We are not in the business of building infrastructure so they can go out and sell that water on the open market and make money. And that requirement is a statutory requirement that we reference in our omnibus construction bills every year. Well, they balked at that. They didn't like that. I think their intent, they do have oil and gas exploration in the area, although that activity has diminished in the last 2 years. So they have balked at that. And we've been back and forth. The agreement has never been signed. We then put some pressure on them to say, it said, we either need a direction from you, you're going to sign this agreement, move the project forward, or we're going to cancel the project. And that has led to some discussion then of, well, we just want to buy the well. And these level 2 wells that we drill, when we get to a level 3 project, we sell it back to the community at 1/3 of the actual cost. And the logic for that is, if we drill that as part of a level 3 project, we would have a 67% grant on the project, and the local entity would be required to pay 33%. So when we transfer those wells, we transfer those at 33% of the actual cost incurred. So their next approach was, and there's a letter behind there that talks about what they would like to do. They would like to buy that well at 33% of the cost and call it good. Well, in consulting with our council, the sale of that well is in the legislation, the Omnibus Construction Bill from 2013, and those requirements of, if you sell water outside of your jurisdiction, 1/3 or 2/3 of the revenue has to come back to the state. They don't like that either. And so we've really given them the option of either we go forward with the project as originally envisioned, or we're going to cancel it. And so my recommendation to you is that we change the reversion date from 2018. We'll change it to 2017, and then those dollars will revert. Or, and I guess this is something the commission could consider, we could potentially sell them the well at the full price, our full price of drilling that well. And I don't believe that they will be interested in that, but they may be here tomorrow to discuss this with you. You have their letters and their request, but statutorily, I don't believe we can just sell them the well for 1/3 of the value. And so my recommendation to you tomorrow will be that we cancel this project. Any questions?
Commissioner Canfield.
If we just cancel that project, what happens to the well? It just sits there as our well. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, it's located on state lands, so we could offer it up to state lands if they had a use for it, or we plug the well. Or we could cap that well and claim some ownership interest, but the reality is we don't have access except through state lands. I mean, we could ultimately acquire an access to do that, but I think in this case, my thought would be is that we'll put it's already got a welded cap on it, that we'll cap it and just leave it in place. The community may change their mind in the future. I don't know. I don't think it warrants plugging at this point in time, but it would not be, certainly not available to Lance Creek.
Sure.
I was going to say, sorry.
Commissioner Reeser.
If we do nothing on this, it automatically ends in 2018 anyway.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, that is correct.
Oh, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Canfield.
How many taps are there in this water district?
Mr. Chairman, my recollection is it's in the 15 to 20 range. And Brian?
I think that's what we
Okay. It's a very small community. I mean, they have, my sense, and I personally have not met with them, but certainly project managers, we've met with them. I get a sense that these sales, these outside community sales to the oil and gas industry have helped fund their water system. And so you can keep your water rates lower by selling this water outside their jurisdiction. Here comes a provision where 2/3 of your revenue has to go back to the state on this well. They don't like that. And that's really where we're at.
Mr. Chairman.
Or Senator Meyer.
Barry, question I have on that is that's 2/3 after the operating costs. It's not 2/3 of the gross. Is that right? And I would hope that would be the way, because otherwise they could be losing money on every gallon they sell.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, over the years, these types of agreements have included that provision and some have not. And what I can tell you from at least my reading of the statute, that it doesn't provide for that provision to take out operating costs, although I know we've done that with some communities. And Abby, I don't know if you have a thought on that or you'd like to read that statute, but it doesn't talk about removing operating costs. It just says a proportionate share has to be returned to the state.
Mr. Chairman, it just seems like if that's what we did back then, we probably made a mistake if that's the way it's interpreted, because why would anybody sell water outside to help themselves if it actually hurts themselves? So that's probably something we need to do, is revisit that particular statute to make sure that shift or that cost split is after the pumping costs and transmission costs to the to the border has been at least at least you break even on it. And then anything after that, if there's any profit, then yeah, the state needs to get their money back. That way we can go back into water development and we can continue to use it. And that's the reason for that. But it seems like it could be self-defeating, and we might actually be prohibiting people from trying to sell outside if it's not to their benefit.
Mr. Chairman?
Commissioner Seacon.
Actually, isn't it the responsibility of that entity to know what their costs are? So that if they come up with a price, I mean, that's what most business people do. They know what their costs are. They're going to sell a product. They know what their overhead is, their operating costs. So they're going to sell, if they want to sell it for under their cost, isn't that their business rather than the state's business? I would assume that they're going to decide what they want to sell their water for. And if they don't take into account their own, overhead, that's not our problem.
I think, Mr. Chairman, that statute or another statute actually puts a cap at 150% or 125% of what the cost of the water is, or the charge of the water that is within the municipality. So they have a cap that they're working under. And, I just think that we need to, we'll probably revisit and look at the economics of it. If we have a statute that is unworkable because it's not economical, you don't want to force municipalities into, maybe they're stupid, but I don't think they're that stupid.
Chairman.
Commissioner Canfield.
Mr. Director, do we have the ability to negotiate a sale of that somewhere between a third and full price, maybe considering some factors like that?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, the statute, which is a Title 99 statute, specifically says that the payment coming back to the state is in proportion to the grant that was offered. I do not believe we have the ability to negotiate.
Chairman?
Sure, easier.
But we could sell it to them on a 100% loan. And then if they are planning to make money off of sales, they've got probably enough time to buy it, to pay it off.
Debt service.
Mr. Chairman, that option, I believe, would require that we put it into the omnibus bill going forward. It would be under a different set of conditions where that would be spelled out, and that ultimately the legislature would have to approve that in that case. But at this point, I've not received any indication that that is an option they want to pursue. So,
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Eklund.
what are they doing now for potable water, drinking water and whatnot?
Mr. Chairman, they have, I believe, at least one other well. But again, what led us down this path was an EPA administrative order that said you have high levels of arsenic. It was either arsenic or uranium. I'm not sure which. But that's what led us to this exploration effort. And this well is better quality water. Now, the last time we met with them, at least their operator claimed that the water quality in their existing well had improved and they no longer were under that order. I'm not sure EPA is of that position, but that's really a business between the community and EPA.
Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, moving on.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, under tab Q, small water project program. I just want to, this is for account 1, and we have a similar scenario in account 2 that I'll touch on. But I just wanted to provide you with the numbers for our small water project program. You currently have a balance in this account of $676,000 and some change. And if you look at the history of, well, certainly in the last 5 years, and at the bottom of that first page, you see the history of appropriations made, starting at $225,000, or these are actual projects allocated. You had a couple of years where it was over $800,000, and then last year you approved $313,000 worth of projects. My recommendation to you is that there is no need for supplemental dollars into this account, but I wanted to present those numbers to you, and if you feel differently, then you can seek an appropriation. But based on last year, certainly, it would appear that $676,000 is adequate going forward. We do have more watershed studies coming online, which could potentially mean more applications. But then if you recall last year, I think it was account 1, where there were a number of projects that you did not fund. So my recommendation is no supplemental funding this year for small water projects in account 1. Questions there?
No questions, Harry.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the next project I'll just mention to you is the Sponsors Contingency Fund, new development. And this is under tab R. And to date, there has been appropriated $2 million for this fund. You have allocated over the history of this 318,000, so the remaining balance is 1.6 million and some change. What is at issue here is that the authorization to spend expires on July 1st, 2017. And so my recommendation to you will be to extend that. I'm suggesting 8 years, which takes you to July 1st, 2025. And the reason I chose that date is that is the same date for the authorization on the small water project program, so that we get those two appropriations kind of running in concert and to make it consistent. Any questions there?
Questions?
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the next one is, it would be the second E tab. And this is the Hog Island Water Master Plan from Teton County. Proposed budget, $165,000. This, if you read the description here, it's south of Jackson. It's a collection of housing subdivisions, segregated tract home sites, pasture land, large mobile home park, and a location of the YDOT offices and maintenance shop. And there's at least, I guess I've been told, a proposed new elementary school. No community water system. This application is to look at a master plan for that entire area. But I will point out, and the reason for me just talking to you about this today is that there is no public entity involved at this point in time. So, questions on that?
No questions, Harry.
Okay. So then that takes care of at least the projects on account one. I guess I would ask if there's other projects in account one you wanted to visit about. I could certainly do that. If not, I'll move to account two. So under the third J tab, excuse me, the third I tab. Small water project program again, only this is account two. The available balance, 517 million and some change. And at the bottom of that page, you can see the last 5 years of appropriation history, not appropriation, but authorization of project history. 75,000, 250,000, 337,000, 276, or 230. So my recommendation to you is that there are adequate funds in account two of the small water project program, and I'm not requesting any additional funds. But if you feel differently and you want to supplement that amount, then we'll have that discussion about that tomorrow, I guess, or that would be Friday. And then the very next tab, J, is the same sponsors contingency fund. That authorization to spend expires July 1st, 2017, and I'm asking that you extend that appropriation date to July 1st, 2025. Now, under, let's see. If you go back to the little notebook, tab B, which has my spreadsheet in there. If you go behind that spreadsheet, there should be, this is a letter. This is dealing with the Willwood irrigation dam. It's titled Shoshone River Cover-Up or Fresh Start. And I know those in the Bighorn Basin have been following this. Willwood Dam, of which you have a project appropriation currently to replace some gates on the dam, and that work is underway. But, and I don't know how many commissioners were on board when the Willwood Dam was toured. Floyd, do you recall that? And Bill? Okay. But we have an irrigation dam. It checks up the river, diverts the water down a canal. And over time, there's a silt load coming down the river. The silt drops out behind the dam. And so that silt has actually plugged up one of 3 gates on the face of the dam that allowed the water to be released and lowered in the winter months. And up until the 1950s, the operation of this dam was that at the end of the irrigation system or season, these 3 gates were opened and the water was flushed down the river, and it took the silt accumulation that had occurred that last year down the river with it. Starting in the 1950s, Game and Fish, and there wasn't a DEQ in those days, but they started to put restrictions on the amount of silt that could be discharged from this structure. I don't know whether that limitation on silt releases or failure to even release these big flows out of the dam caused the silt to build up. And so since the 1950s, silt has been building up behind this reservoir to the point where it plugged off 1 gate, and the second, it plugged off 2 gates. They only had 1 operable gate. Our project was to go back in and to try to make at least 2 of the 3 gates operable, and to replace the main gates on the canal and the dam as well. And we thought that there was going to be a fair amount of silt removal required to gain access to these gates on the dam. And as it turned out, Engineering Associates was the engineer here, and working with the district, they were able to free up and make the second gate operable. They're now replacing the valve stems on these gates, and so our project has been reduced in scope in that we've not removed the silt that we anticipated we would have to. As a result, we expect that there's going to be about $300,000 left in this budget, and that expiration for that appropriation is July 1st, 2017. So what happened this fall was when they got ready to, after the irrigation season, to lower the water level behind this dam, and at least Game and Fish was involved, DEQ was involved. There was a waiver provided to the district allowing a certain amount of silt to be released from the gates. When they opened the gates finally and lowered the water level, then a large amount of silt started sloughing off of the accumulation. It was flushed downstream. I've seen the pictures. I didn't bring pictures with me, but it was of a sufficient concentration that there was a significant fish kill downstream that obviously alarmed fishermen, the Game and Fish, and DEQ. A notice of violation has been issued, I've been told, to the Willwood Irrigation District. And the question now is, how do we deal with all this silt that has accumulated behind this dam? And so this is not a project that shows up in the spreadsheet, but I am going to recommend to you tomorrow that we extend the appropriation date from July 1st, 2017 to 2018, so that the district can use those dollars in formulating a plan of how we're going to deal with that in the future. And right now, there's members of the community that think that all of the silt behind this dam should be removed. That's probably somewhere on the order of a $5 million plus type of cost. There's some other thoughts that we may be able to do some design modifications and just let the silt build up. But I would say that this is a situation in flux, and I want to provide the district with some flexibility to use these dollars to look at this ongoing problem. And with that, I would entertain any questions, or we have experts from the Bighorn Basin with us today. Jeanette is on the Shoshone River, so I don't know how involved you've been, but David, you're a member of Willwood Irrigation District?
Yes,
Okay.
I've been involved with it.
So I just think I want to provide the flexibility to the district to be able to work with DEQ and the Game and Fish in working out a suitable solution to what is, and I would characterize it, Willwood Irrigation District is not putting this silt in the river. This is all silt being generated upstream. It just so happens that the dam slows the water up during the irrigation season and the silt drops out behind their dam.
Chairman, if I may?
Go ahead.
That's exactly right. As the dam is in the operation during the irrigation season, it turns into a stilling pond, and that's silt and gravel, and I've seen cobble as big as my fists coming out of the dam right now, but there's quite an accumulation behind it. And because of a DEQ saying that we can change the water quality by no more than 10 NTUs from one side of the dam to the other side of the dam as it goes through the water goes through the dam, there's no chance of moving any of the silt in the past since the 1982 or 84, somewhere in there is where they put that restriction on. And so it's really built up about 1.5 miles back upstream. This, I guess you would call silt, but it's just silt that's moving down the river, and it just happens to be stilled there. And normally it would be moving down the river regardless.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Ekman.
Kind of a question on that. So because of these rules, you're not able to push that silt on through the system and into the fields
Prior to
the fishery.
Yeah, prior to 1950, the BOR, which is Bureau of Rec, had a operating procedure on the dam. You open the left gate and run it for a week. You open the center gate, you run it for a week. You open the right gate for a week, and then you just move back and forth, and you just plane out that silt that's behind it and move it downstream. And at that time, somewhere in the 50s, the Game and Fish came in, and as Harry said, changed that and said, you can't do that. You can't put that much silt down the river at one time. So that at that time, then the silt started building up behind the dam because there was a restriction on how much we could flush.
Mr. Chairman, kind of a follow-up on it, but you're not putting it in the river, you're putting it in the fields is kind of what I'm thinking. Can you do that instead of getting it keep it out of the fishery?
We can't go down, we can't move the silt down the canal because you'll plug the canal eventually.
Questions for Representative Northrup or for Harry? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, with that, I would move to account 3. And I don't want to necessarily take a lot of time with regards to the first 4 projects, but we are, just to let you know, my recommendation to you is to seek construction funding, level 3 funding for 4 reservoir projects with this omnibus construction bill. They are Big Sandy Reservoir enlargement at $8.4 million, Middle Piney Reservoir $12.1 million and some change, Alkali Creek Reservoir $35 million, and Levitt Reservoir expansion $41 million. And those are 4 projects in the governor's 10 and 10 program that I think that we're ready to move forward and allocate those construction dollars for those projects. Then on State Line Dam enlargement, phase 3, request was for $300,000, and this was, if you go to, it would be the second R tab in the big notebook. This is it. So 2 years ago, we started Meeks Cabin. Level 2, phase 1 study of enlarging Meeks Cabin Dam. Meeks Cabin sits on the Blacks Fork, but there are 2 Bureau of Reclamation facilities in that basin, Meeks Cabin being one of them, the other being State Line. And as part of the phase 1 evaluation of Meeks Cabin, we look at alternatives. State Line and enlargement of State Line Dam was also identified as a viable alternative. And so the Conservancy District, Bridger Valley Conservancy District, has brought an application that they would now want to also pursue an enlargement of the State Line Dam. And we are not finished with the Meeks Cabin Level 2 Phase 1. I expect that will be completed sometime in the March timeframe, Jason, I think. Yeah. And so my thoughts to you is that rather than, because that's actually a component of the Meeks Cabin study, I'd like to complete that. And I've talked to the district about this in terms of my logic. And then next year, if they want to bring a level 2, phase 2 request for State Line, we will have all of the information coming out of Meeks Cabin that applies to State Line, State Line. And then go forward at that point in time, but I believe that it's premature at this point in time. So hence my recommendation is for no funding on that project. Any questions?
For Harry.
And I think Bridger Valley will be here tomorrow. So you can certainly question them at that point in time. The last project, well, actually, maybe there's two projects. West Fork Reservoir, I've already touched on that. The request is for $6.2 million. That is for level 2, phase 3. And that is in essence to reappropriate those dollars which expired last July 1st. As I said earlier today, it was initially a $7 million appropriation. We have been working, performing modeling, additional modeling, and dealing with the copper question coming out of the Ferris Haggerty mine upstream of this reservoir site. We've spent a fair amount of time doing that. I think we've come to a solution there where we don't believe it's going to be a problem compounded by a reservoir. So we're wanting to move forward with special use permit application, ultimately it'll lead to EIS and design of that facility. But I need reauthorization of the remaining balance of that $7 million appropriation. So that's the $6,220,000 request there. Questions on West Fork?
No questions.
Okay, so then I skipped over a project in account 1. This would be under tab T. Broken Wheel Ranch groundwater supply. This is a smaller public water system in Lincoln County. Their request is for $350,000, level 2 groundwater exploration. And their situation is that their existing well, which is serving approximately 50 people, has in essence dried up. It's producing a gallon or 2 a minute, and they're having to haul water. So they're wanting to move forward. We did the level 1. It said, you need to seek additional groundwater supply. So the level 2 is the logical extension of that, drill the well. But they are not a district. And so under that same tab, the very last page, you should have a letter from the Board of Lincoln County Commissioners, which outlines that in fact a petition to form this district has been filed, and they had a public hearing on October 19th. There's now a required public comment period. And so at least from this document, it's my belief that a district will be formed probably in the next 2 months. But by your criteria, we cannot proceed with a level 2 study without a public entity. So I believe that they will be here tomorrow to plead their case with you. But that was my logic. It was not that there isn't a need. I think there is a real need. Representative McKim is from that area. Like to have them, it's a public water system, but they are not a public entity. And so by your criteria, my recommendation would be no funding.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Dockstader.
Thank you, Director. When you say criteria, has there ever, do you have any precedents where a potential district has been funded if they're en route to becoming a district? Has there been anything in history like that at all?
Nothing that comes to my mind. We've generally focused on level 1 studies where the commission can waive that requirement for level 1 studies, but it's pretty clear that at level 2 they need to be a district.
Mr. Chairman, let's follow up.
Go ahead.
So say they're within 30 days or so, based on this letter. When's their next opportunity? You have to wait till after the winter?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, their next opportunity will be a year from now. It's a once a year funding cycle. Mr. Chairman, I will throw this out for the commission's consideration. You could approve this subject to a district formation, and that could be written into the bill if you so choose.
Chairman, have we done that before, Harry? I mean, it seems to me there's been some conditions on a few of these projects over the years.
Mr. Chairman, that Senator, that not a complete analogy, but the one set of special conditions we've used is that we've had a special condition that districts where we have one district connecting to another district, that they have to have a water service agreement in place before the money is released. So that's a special condition we use. It's not the same as this case. And that was on a construction project.
Commissioner Reeser.
When would you release the when would you send out the RFP on this to get consultants involved?
Mr. Chairman, so our standard process would be that in January, we will release a request for statements of interest. And then from that, we shortlist hopefully to 5 firms, and a request for proposals is released somewhere about the first part of March.
I mean, so we could put a condition on it that if a district was formed by March 1st, it goes ahead. If not, it doesn't.
Or Mr. Chairman, the other way to approach that would be that appropriation is subject to the formation of a district. So if the district isn't formed till July, once they provide evidence of that, then we could proceed with a separate procurement for engineering services at that time. That would be another way to handle it.
Chairman, so you mean, in other words, you're not really committing the money till July 1st?
We would not commit money until a district has been formed, and it would have no specific date or timing on that.
Mr. Chair, one of the things that might help too, I think, I'm a proponent of trying to help these types of entities or groups that haven't formed a public entity yet, at least under certain circumstances. And this would be clearly an exception because it's level 2. And having a condition on it would be one part of it, but I think a good part of the motion also would be to specify that because it's somewhat of an emergency situation, because this well dried up in September, and that way we don't have other applicants coming back and say, well, you did it for this group. We'd at least specify some of the facts that made this something that we wanted to consider. So I'm thinking of that if we decide to do that tomorrow, is adding that in with the condition.
Representative McKim.
We went down and looked at this and just went through with this, with them on it. They do have the commitment of at least 80% of their people with signed letters indicating they will form a district. Once again, it's simply a time thing they got caught in, and it has become an emergency for them simply because the well will not keep up now, and they have to buy the water and haul it in.
Okay. Questions, comments on this project? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, that kind of concludes at least the projects I wanted to just chat with you about. So I have nothing else to discuss this afternoon. And just a reminder, we're scheduled to start 8:30 in this room tomorrow morning.
Representative Blake.
Thank you. On that same page there, Harry G. Opal, they didn't want $5,000 for their well improvement, or?
Mr. Chairman, I was trying to slide that one through. You caught me. We've completed the level 1 master plan for Opal. It identified some well house improvements. They brought their request for that in the amount, was it $4,600 in assistance?
$1,680.
Wait a minute, let me get to the right page.
$1,690, it says.
Yeah, overall, it's a $7,000 project. wellhead and well piping functions. They're talking about putting some better screening on some wells. There was some valving in one of their wellhead buildings that they wanted to install, and a hydrant. And my recommendation is to not fund, because that, to me, that really falls under more of the operation and maintenance function. Again, I would not have any heartburn if you wanted to fund them. It's a small amount of money, but just kind of, we routinely do turn applications down when we get requests for maintenance or fixing something or improving it. And I kept with that kind of approach in this case.
For the commission and the committee, the folks from OPAL will be here tomorrow to see if they can visit with the commission on this issue. I mean, I know 800 and some dollars seems like not a lot of money but for the town of OPAL, that's half of all the money they have. So, I mean, this is a very small town. And this has, a lot of this has to do, as Harry and I talked about it a day or two ago, is it's kind of in one of those gray area situations for funding, and Harry can probably address that a little bit better, but it has to do with their wells too. And they did in the level 1 study, talked about the fact that, if I remember right, that the DQ wanted them to replace the wellhead seals and stuff like this. So it really has to do with the actual water source and well, more than it does have to do with the distribution system or within the town and stuff like that. So they do have some other things they have to do, which this money will go to do, that are not within the scope of the commission funding. And they understand that. But if they have to spend it on this, then they can't do the other projects downstream from the well house. So they were just asking, it's a very small amount of money. It's like, say, to a little town like this, it's half of all the money that they have, other than what they get for producing the water all the time. There's only 37 taps in this whole town for this water. So if any of you guys have gone past OPAL, it was a town that got started many, many, many years ago, and it was along the railroad there, and it was where they brought all the cows down from up north, from up around Karen's part of the countryside up there. They used to drive the cows down to the railhead there at OPAL, and that's how the name OPAL got started. But it's just a very small town. If you blink your eye and go past it on the highway, you probably would miss it. So anyway, these people will be here tomorrow to plead their case to you. So I just thought I'd bring that up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything else to add to our workshop today? Okay, meeting adjourned.
It actually does part of the. Gallup check in, didn't invite you down for 3 beer and wine.